All right, we are live.
All right.
Joining me today is an ultra special guest, David Chalmers. So, Dave, for those who don't know you, can you say something about who you are and what you do?
Sure. My name is David Chalmers. I'm professor of philosophy at New York University, where I'm also co-director of the Center for Mind, Brain, and Consciousness. And I guess I work on many aspects of philosophy, but especially the philosophy of mind and consciousness and the way it connects to the science of consciousness. So I've been coming at consciousness from many different angles for I guess for many years now. I'm also really interested in a whole bunch of other issues in philosophy, language, metaphysics, epistemology, science, and also things like the foundations of physics, foundations of cognitive science, and so on. So, but I guess consciousness is at the core.
Yeah. Is it true that too? I think I read somewhere that you said that originally you kind of just wanted to think about consciousness, but then you realized that trying to answer those questions sucked you into all those other traditional areas of philosophy.
Yeah, pretty much. I remember years ago when I was like a math student, just reading philosophy, reading these philosophers going on about Hesperus and Phosphorus, and thinking, oh my God, what's this boring semantic issues? What's this all about? But I found that to think about consciousness and the mind-body problem, rapidly I was thinking about, for example, metaphysics. That got me thinking about language. That got me thinking about epistemology. That got me thinking about foundations of science. So before you know, you're getting into almost all of philosophy. I did swear at one point that I was never going to write a paper in ethics. I think I've still stuck to that so far, but I feel myself weakening on that one.
Yeah, I think the last section of your book on value maybe is going to break that rule at some point.
Yeah, right? Yeah. At least I've got a couple of chapters in there on value. So yeah,
that's very. I mean, speaking of which, this book, I don't know if people know that you're working on this book, Reality 2.0. Is that the title of it?
That's the working title, Reality 2.0, Virtual Worlds and the Great Problems of Philosophy. I don't know. It's very much a working title. Many people have told me, you can't use that. It's such a cliche. It's like 20 years ago. So if anyone's got a better way of saying Reality 2.0 without the 2.0, let me know, because it does capture what the book is about. It's about artificial realities, virtual reality, the idea of the world as a simulation, and so on, and using the idea of artificial realities to explore the concept of reality and to explore all kinds of philosophical issues, whether epistemological issues such as skepticism, metaphysical issues about the nature of reality, God, mind, value. So it's meant to be a book that anyone can read, but also tries to really get into some substantial philosophy.
I mean, I've seen a sneak preview of it, and I think it does that, actually. I think it's really aimed at the right level. I think it's going to be a great book when it comes out. We've been waiting for a book like this. I do notice that I thought I heard you one time in a talk or something say you were trying to use the word techno-philosophy, like neurophilosophy, but I noticed that wasn't anywhere in the book anymore.
Oh yeah, that'll be in the introduction, which isn't written yet. At one point, I thought about calling the book techno-philosophy, and actually, my literary agent, who was he was promoting the book to publishers, he said, "You can't call it techno-philosophy. That sounds too academic." And, so I moved away from that, but maybe that'll be in the introduction. I do think of it. I mean, this is inspired by neurophilosophy, Patricia Churchland's term, which has come to mean kind of a two-way interaction between philosophy and neuroscience, thinking philosophically about neuroscience, but also using neuroscience to think about philosophical questions. Right. So that's how I think of it with techno-philosophy. We're using philosophy to think about issues about technology, but we're also using these technological tools to gain insight to thinking about some very traditional philosophical questions.
Yeah.
That's to some large part what I'm trying to do in the book.
Yeah. And I think that's really, it's time for that to happen. So I mean, there hasn't been anything since, I guess, what was that book? That guy wrote this book, A Philosophy of Art, Virtual Reality or something. That was a while ago. I forget who it was, actually. He's maybe a non-academic philosopher.
On philosophical issues about virtual reality, yeah, there's been a few things here and there. There's a lot of people who write on video games, which at least connects. So people like Mark Silcox and John Cogburn and a bunch of other people who work in the sort of the philosophy of gaming, Grant Tavenor, Jesper Juhl and others have written about video games as an art form and have talked, for example, about the ontological status of those. And I think the issues there begin to connect to the issues about virtual reality and about artificial realities more generally. But also video games are something of a special case.
Right.
They're fictional, they involve role playing and so on. Where I think the issues about VR in general are in some ways broader. I mean, people have thought about, of course, people think about these old ideas of the world as a simulation. There's the classic Nick Bostrom paper on that. I wrote a paper on this years ago called "The Matrix as Metaphysics," which was actually originally for the website of the movie, the Matrix, where they wanted to get some philosophers involved in writing about philosophical issues that arose from the movie. I'd been thinking about writing a technical paper called "Envatment as a Metaphysical Hypothesis" about the whole brain in a vat idea. So yeah, well, I could totally reframe this around the movie and called it instead "The Matrix as Metaphysics." That's actually one of my favorite papers. I tried to argue that, even if we are in a simulation like the Matrix, nonetheless, all this is perfectly real. Many people think, now this would all be then fictional or an illusion. My line is, no, even if we are in the Matrix, all this is real. And in a way, that kind of idea is at the foundation of what I'm arguing in this book too, Reality 2.0. The rough idea is that, virtual reality is a kind of genuine reality. It's not a second-class reality. It's not a fake or fictional reality. It's a kind of genuine reality.
Right. So this is what you call digital realism?
Yeah. Virtual realism sometimes, for the idea of things in virtual reality are real. And in particular, virtual digitalism, I think I call it in some places. When you're in a virtual reality or a simulation and so on, you're interacting with real objects. They're just digital objects, something like data structures on a computer, but they're no less real for that.
Right. So the basic idea, I think, is that as I understand the argument roughly, is that you're interacting with something which is lawfully guiding the behavior of the digital object. So there's bits at the computer level which are causally interacting with each other, and so that there would be no real reason to distinguish what's going on at that level from what's going on at the microphysical level and what we call physical reality. It's just a way of interacting with an object.
Well, they're different, but I think in some ways no less real. I mean, the easiest case to start with is the one where it turns out that all along our physical reality has been grounded in some digital reality, as in the Matrix case, as on the simulation hypothesis. Everything I experience is and always has been computer simulation. I guess on that, some people say, oh no, well then this would be, none of the things we experience would be real. This is a skeptical hypothesis. I want to say, no, these things are still real. They're just digital. I mean, even physics exists more or less as we thought it was. It's just that physics is realized by an underlying digital level, which is not how we actually think it is, but it doesn't mean that there's no physics there. It just means there's a level of digital processes underneath the level of physics, and there's something else underneath that. Now, if we set aside the simulation hypothesis and suppose we're not in a simulation, then okay, our world is presumably non-digital unless physics turns out to go in an interesting digital direction anyway. But we can then contrast it with, say, virtual realities, the kinds we experience when we put on a VR headset and so on, and say, okay, well, these ones are digital realities, so they're different. Physical reality will be non-virtual. Virtual realities will be virtual. So they're different realities in that case. But I still want to say, in some sense, the virtual reality is still real. It's no less real than it would have been if we'd been living in a virtual reality our whole life. It'll be different from the reality we've grown up in. So we might reasonably have different attitudes to it because of that. We might especially value the reality, the original reality, the one we've been embedded in and grown to value. But nonetheless, I think virtual realities can still be perfectly real. They can be places where you could live a meaningful life. We could transition into virtual reality, spend a good part of our lifetimes there and have a perfectly meaningful life there. Again, it would be different in various respects from a non-virtual reality, but still meaningful, still valuable. So I guess that's where I start to veer into questions about value that may eventually break my resistance to thinking about ethics.
Exactly. So I know you draw a distinction between a virtual world and a virtual reality. Is a virtual world is just one that's not immersive completely, whereas a virtual reality is. So the World of Warcraft is a world, but not a reality. Is that the right way of using those terms?
Yeah, that's how I use them in the book. And there's also an article I published about this stuff that came out a couple of years ago called The Virtual and the Real. And there, I guess I used, what's virtual reality? It's a fairly standard definition. A virtual reality environment is an environment which is immersive, interactive, and computer generated. 3 conditions. Immersive basically means you experience it, sort of 3-dimensionally from the center of a perceptual world, perceiving it as if it's a world around you. That's the feeling of being there. Interactive means it's not just you perceive this reality, you can affect it too. What you do will have effects on that reality. And computer generated means all those processes, the inputs you're getting are grounded in the processes of a computer. So ordinary reality is immersive and interactive, but presumably it's not computer generated unless the simulation hypothesis is true. So so VR as standardly construed has to meet those 3 conditions. Then you might ask, though, what about, say, video games like World of Warcraft or even Second Life played on a desktop on a screen? It doesn't fully meet the immersiveness condition because it's just on this flat screen. It's not the 3D feeling of being there, immersion. So it's not, strictly speaking, virtual reality. But I think the way people commonly talk about this, they nonetheless call these worlds virtual worlds. So following that practice, I say, well, to be a virtual world, you don't have to meet the immersiveness condition. Just being computer generated and interactive is good enough. And then we can also entertain hypotheses like, what if it's not interactive? Then it's just like a 360 video, very passive. Maybe it's stretching things to call that VR or even a reality or a world at all. But there are different grades of these things. But the core case is when you meet those 3 conditions: immersive, interactive, computer generated.
But you're still going to want to say that the digital objects in a world are still as real as they are in the virtual reality.
Yeah, that's right. I think I want to make probably the ontological point about the reality of the objects applies equally inside the mere virtual world that's not immersive. I mean, there's interesting questions about some of the other theses I talk about. One is that perception inside virtual reality needn't be an illusion. It may be in some cases. When you don't know you're in VR, someone puts a headset on you, you might perceive, this is going on in the regular physical world when it's going on in the virtual world. But I want to argue that at least for a sophisticated user of VR, your perception needn't be illusory or hallucinatory. You can be having veridical perception of the digital objects around you. You perceive them as virtual objects, and that's what they are. It's an interesting question to what extent that point transfers to the case of a virtual world on a desktop. I think probably something like it transfers, but it gets a bit more complicated because you've now got this whole screen-like representation that's rather different from ordinary perception, as opposed to the VR case, where the experiences really do seem to be kind of continuous with ordinary perception.
Yeah, that's what I was kind of going to ask you about, is whether you would allow some kind of like levels of reality. Sometimes people talk about these things. So maybe the digital objects in World of Warcraft are real, but not quite as real as the one in a fully immersive world, because of the immersivity of it, because there's tactile sensations, you can interact with it more fully. But it sounds like what you're saying is that you're sort of going to resist that kind of move.
Well, there's degrees of virtuality, let's say, for sure, and there's degrees of immersiveness. And in general, there's different criteria for reality. I'm not sure that I've got a single one-size-fits-all criterion for what it is for something to be real. But at one point in the book, I go through various different criteria. There's Berkeley's dictum, to be is to be perceived. Okay, well, most people don't quite accept that one, but you might think, okay, it's nonetheless a heuristic guide. If something's perceivable or observable, that's at least some indication of it being real. There's Alexander's dictum, to be real is to play a causal role.
Yeah, I was so just not to interrupt too fast, but that you're attributing to an Australian philosopher? Because I thought that was like an ancient Greek.
Time and deity. What's that?
Armstrong called that the Eleatic principle because of the ancient Greek guy.
I think it goes back a long way, but I think it's, for whatever reason, it gets called Alexander's dictum pretty regularly these days.
Okay.
I don't think it starts with him, but this is just a general instance of the fact, right, that whenever you have X's law, it's almost never originated by X.
Exactly.
This is like someone or other's law of political economy, and whoever it is, Stiglitz's law of political economy.
We'll call it Chalmers' law of
Yeah.
no one's ever actually the namesake of their own law.
Exactly.
Okay, so but go on. So there's like to be is to be perceived. I mean, to be fair, Berkeley was talking to empiricists, and it is hard to see if you're an empiricist what else. I guess maybe, you know, Quinean to be is to be the valuable variable would be more of a modern empiricist take on that.
Yeah, I mean, many of us want to allow things which are not perceived, maybe perhaps not even perceivable, but then we want to say, well, they can still be real, and then then they might be real in virtue of meeting some of the other conditions, like being playing a causal role, for example. Another one I like comes from Philip K. Dick, where he says something is real if when you stop believing in it, it doesn't go away. This is basically a way of putting what philosophers call mind independence. It's basically, things in your mind don't stop it from existing. Changing your mind, its existence doesn't depend on the state of your mind. Now, of course, you don't want to make that a general criterion for reality, because then what about states of your mind?
Right.
Maybe they depend on my mind, but they're still real. Nonetheless, for an awful lot of things in the external world, one of the things that matters when thinking about their reality is a certain kind of independence of the mind.
Yeah, I was wondering about the Philip K. Dick stuff, because he's sort of well known, I think, for having schizophrenia, right, and having some notebooks that were filled with all sorts of strange things. One tends to get the feeling that maybe he says stuff like that because he's having these kind of maybe delusions, and he wants to count them as real.
It could be. I don't know that much about his biography. I do know he wrote an awful lot about alternate worlds, dream realities, artificial realities, hallucinatory realities. So this seems to have been a very major theme in his work.
Right, but is that
there's also a famous video where he actually comes out and like I said, a science fiction convention, he says, I think maybe we really are in a simulation right now, back in the 1970s.
Wow. He was a forward thinker. But I mean, I guess what I was trying to say was, is that a problem for the dictum? That if you have some kind of, if you have like a delusion, like Capgras delusion or something, you think you're dead, or your loved ones have been replaced by identical duplicates that are not them. That's not going to go away simply if it's a really powerful delusion, you may even sort of feel that you're deluded and still be in the grip of it. So would that end up meaning that those things are real? Is that a kind of a result of that dictum?
Yeah, maybe it shows that the Philip K. Dick version of it is a bit too strong. You stop believing in it, but there's still some pre-belief process, like some perceptual process,
right,
that makes it real for you. So probably, one wants to generalize it to something like not just independence of what you believe, but independence of your mind in general. In this case, it looks like, well, maybe it doesn't depend on your beliefs, but it depends on your perceptual states,
right,
and so on. So then it's still mind dependent, and at least to that extent, not fully real. But I think of what Dick is trying to get at is at least one version of this mind independence criteria.
Yeah. I mean, to go back to some of the other things, I guess I was a little bit surprised at the way you treated Berkeley and Descartes in your analysis.
Mm-hmm.
I thought that at one point you ended up saying that even if we were in an evil genius scenario, that we would still have our ordinary beliefs preserved, and things would still be real. There'd still be a table in front of me and my coffee is sitting on and stuff. Is that not only in the, so that's not a virtual reality since it's not computer generated, so it fails on that third part of the criteria. It's immersive and all that other stuff, but is that right, that you're going to count those things as real if this is a...
Which hypothesis are we on now? Is it the
evil genius hypothesis?
Evil genius hypothesis. Yeah, I mean, it depends on exactly how the evil genius is doing it, but if the evil genius is doing it by roughly having a very detailed model of the world in its head and using that to simulate all the to feed experiences to you based on the simulation, then I think the evil genius is basically playing the role of the computer in the matrix, and what we're perceiving is real, although it is processes in the evil genius's head. So it's to that extent mind dependent, not dependent on your own mind, but dependent on someone else's mind. insofar as you take that as your criterion for reality, you might say it's to that extent less real. But otherwise, I think it's more or less analogous to something like the simulation case. And also Berkeley's case, where it's God, is, I take it, more or less analogous to this too. God's mind is in this case playing the role of the computer. That's something independent of your own mind that's generating the experiences in your mind. So I would count that here as, yeah, relevantly analogous and real. If we're in the evil demon world, then it turns out that, yeah, the things I'm interacting with here are genuine, but grounded in the demon's mind. And same for Berkeley's God hypothesis.
Okay, so yeah, because I thought, so I guess I misunderstood part of what you were saying there, because I thought what you ended up saying was that it's not that way for Berkeley, but it is that way for Descartes. And I guess I must have misread.
What did I say about Berkeley? I may have forgotten my own views here.
Yeah, I don't remember. I mean, I don't have the thing pulled up right in front of me, but I thought that you were saying that that Berkeley's view doesn't count as a simulation view. I must be wrong. I'll have to go back.
Berkeley's view with God?
Yeah.
I'm thinking God is kind of playing the role of the, at least one way of thinking about God is playing the role of the simulator. Another way of thinking about God is God doesn't need to do any of that.
Right.
Minor simulation in his head and just automatically generates this stuff. And then I don't know what to say about it.
Oh, I see. So you're building quite a bit into the fact that God's having a model in mind in order for.
I guess so. Yeah. I guess I'm thinking. I thought Berkeley. Not that I have any real expertise on Berkeley. I thought that Berkeley thought that when you have an idea of the table, this is somehow reflecting or picking up on God's idea of the table. So God has all these ideas which are somehow interacting, and as the world develops,
right? Yeah, I think
mirroring an evolution among God's ideas. If that's the case, then it looks like God's big set of ideas is relevantly analogous to a computer running a simulation.
Okay. So
also different in many ways.
In that limited way, then you would accept SAS Percipe, right? I mean, that in the Berkeley world, that is what real is.
Yeah. Well, I guess if you think about, I mean, there's a kind of a really basic, like, first lecture on Berkeley way of thinking about Berkeley, where it's all stuff in your own mind.
Right.
Anything is real if it's perceived by me. And then the God picture, I think, basically ends up giving up on that because, there can be things that are real, like the tree and the quad, never perceived by me, but as long as it's perceived by God. So to be real now is to be perceived by somebody, including God. And I take it God's perceptions are really the ones that where the rubber hits the road. So I guess I don't agree with Berkeley that to be is to be perceived, even to be perceived by God. But I agree with a more limited thesis that to be perceived by God in this way, in the context of a model fed to us, suffices to be real.
Okay, so yeah, interesting. So then how is it that the simulation hypothesis is different from idealism more generally, if you allow that God is playing this role and that these external things are really ideas and gods are perceptions in a God-like mind? On your view, they'd be digital processes in a computer, but so maybe the substrate's going to be different, but ultimately isn't it sort of similar?
Well, the first thing to say is idealism requires a mind at the base. Berkeley has a mind at the base, but certainly these general realism about virtual reality that I have in mind doesn't require anything like a mind at the base. A mind is just one version. It could equally be a computer involving no mind at all.
Well, could it really though? I mean,
so I'd say rather the idea that's really driving this for me is not idealism so much as structuralism. Right. What matters for our conception of the external world is a certain kind of structure, especially causal structure, which could be realized in an ordinary physical world, could be realized in a computer, or could be realized in God's mind. It could even be realized in lots of little bits of consciousness, as on the panpsychist hypothesis. So there's four different versions of this.
So if you take the computational version of it, these fundamental computational processes aren't going to have anything in common with minds? Yeah,
well, anything has a lot of things in common with anything. So,
well, isn't there a way
at the very least, they'll have their causal role in common. and a certain kind of structure in common. But if we're not panpsychists, then they won't literally be minds. They'll be non-mental bits of fundamental reality interacting with each other.
Yeah, but what makes them non-mental, I guess, is what I'm asking.
Well, I suppose if you're an extreme functionalist, you'd say that they'd be non-mental because of some role that they play. You have to be a very, very extreme functionalist, like a functionalist panpsychist. But otherwise, what's the basic reason for wanting to call these things mental, any more than I want to call the processes inside my desktop computer mental?
Well, I'm wondering why you don't want to call them mental.
Well, what's the motivation for calling them mental?
Well, they represent states of affairs in the world, and might sort of there be kind of, counted as a sort of awareness of those states if you push the notion of awareness far enough. I'm wondering why you're not going to say something. I mean, I'm not endorsing it or saying you have to. I wonder what, at that point, what's really the distinguishing factor, unless you were going to bring consciousness in or, phenomenal consciousness.
I see. I mean, even the claim that they represent is a substantive one. I mean, some digital processes represent things in the world. Some don't, in my view. They're just digital processes interacting with other digital processes. So in my view, not all computation involves representation. If you look at most of the stuff going on inside my iPhone or my Mac, some bits of it are engaged in representation, but a lot of bits are not. Even for those bits which are, I guess I wouldn't be especially inclined to call them mental any more than I want to call like the words on a page of a book mental. That's representation, but it's not mental representation. Well, in the book, it's linguistic representation. In a picture, it's pictorial representation. In a computer, it's digital representation. Those are all varieties of representation, but I would be inclined to distinguish all of those from mental representation.
Well, the first two, I guess I would want to say they're derivative on mental representations. But obviously, you don't think computation. I mean, I know there's this general line out there coming from Searle that all computations are observer relative, and you have a line against that, which I think is pretty good, actually. But
I also individuate computation independently of representation. I think computational structure, algorithmic structure, is a matter of causal structure and causal interaction. All this is prior to the level of semantics or representation. Now, as a matter of fact, I think these do. I think there's many ways in which computer processes can represent things in the world. Some of those I think are observer dependent. Some of them come from us as a user, but some of them may not. They may be due to causal tracking, to certain kinds of isomorphism and so on. I don't want to deny that there can be genuine representation here. I just don't see any particular reason to think it's mental any more than tree rings. Tree rings may in some sense mind independently represent the age of a tree, but I don't see any particular reason to think that shows that tree rings are themselves mental states.
I see what you're saying.
It does raise the question: what is the mark of the mental?
Yeah, that's what I'm pressing for.
Not that I have a great analysis of that. I guess I'm inclined to think consciousness is at least at the core one conception of mentality, but maybe things like intentionality in a much broader sense than representation is also involved. If you don't want to require consciousness for mentality, maybe we can say something like robust intentionality, where it's an interesting question what robust intentionality involves beyond mere representation. I am inclined to make a distinction between those and think, even a tree ring can have representation. A person has genuine intentionality, which involves things like genuine normativity, which is some kind of, I think it probably goes along with a certain kind of justification and a notion of rationality in your thinking. It's an interesting question whether there's some level of genuine intentionality that doesn't require applicability of notions like rationality and normativity. But anyway, I think consciousness and normativity provide two ways to at least to draw a line between the merely representational and the mental.
Good. Okay. And then I wanted to also, just while we're on this topic of computation and all this stuff, you define computation in terms of, I guess, digits, manipulating things that are encoded in a series of zeros and ones. I know you could have any base of, so it doesn't have to be binary. It could be any number, but binary is the most common that we use. And certainly that's what you appeal to in the book at some point, is that there's zeros and ones there. And I was wondering how literal I'm supposed to take that, because I sort of understand what it means to have these things represented in the hard drive of a computer. Guess I'm a little less clear about what it means just for there to be zeros and ones that aren't physically instantiated or in some physical way. So I just wondered, like, how literal are we supposed to take this, that involves digits or numbers?
Yeah, I guess the zero and one part is not meant to be taken literally. I mean, 0 and 1 are a couple of mathematical entities. You could say that these represent 0 and 1 under a kind of a certain mind-dependent mapping. I think more important, though, is it's two different states. I always like this idea. Information is a difference that makes a difference. So bits are, information, of course, has many different ways of understanding it. One notion of information is semantic information. What is it that you're representing? The relevant notion I'm dealing with here, though, isn't semantic information. It's what I call structural information, which doesn't involve any essential connection to representation. It just involves, a sequence of bits. A state can be 1 or it can be 0. The next state can be 1 or it can be 0. These states are basically different from each other, but there's no other essential connection to 1 or 0 or even to representational content. It's basically a structure of states. It's a space of states with a certain kind of structure. 0 or 1 just means two states which are different from each other, and then you get sequences of bits which are, correspond to structures of these states which can be different from one another. I mean, I think you can map all this out quite nicely using the same kind of formalism I use to analyze computation in terms of combinatorial states. But anyway, I don't think there's anything essential about understanding bits as zeros and ones.
Okay.
Now, zeros and ones are just labels for this state and the other state.
Okay, so it's anything that's sort of maximally opposite from the other thing. I mean, they can't.
Yeah, it doesn't have to be maximally opposite. It just has to be different in a
regular. Because they be continuous computation.
Voltage. Yeah. Something which has two different levels: voltage above this level, voltage below this level. Turns out the computer is set up to respect that division in its processing, so that later states depend on those values of the earlier states. So yeah, you've got a difference that makes a difference.
What's it make a difference to?
More bits.
I know what it makes a difference to in the physical instantiation of it, but I'm not sure in the abstract what the difference is supposed to be.
Well, I'm talking about the concrete processes here, really. I guess I really have in mind concrete states here as the information states, like the information inside my iPhone or inside my computer. There are certain strings of bits which are present there concretely. I mean, just with computer programs or algorithms, there's this idea that there's a concrete program or concrete machine running an abstract program. And then so the programs are fully abstract. But I think once you start thinking about it more carefully, there's really a level of isomorphism between an abstract program and a kind of a concretely realized program, which is right there, actually running on the desktop. And there's a mapping from one to the other. And there are these abstract states like 0 and 1 strings that map on to these physical states that realize them. And I think, but there really are concretely information states inside the computer. Those aren't merely abstract objects inhabiting the third realm. The series of transistors can be encoding a whole bunch of bits. And I want to say that there's a certain sense in which that information state is concretely realized inside the computer. And I want to say that is actually doing something. The fact that that inside some computer it's got the bits representing one more brown, corresponding to one more brown. Let's not even say representing. Encoding that somehow, but that set of bits is actually playing a causal role. And originally inside your computer, it got uploaded to the internet, it got downloaded. Here, some point it might have got turned into pixels. All those bits are, I think, concretely playing causal roles inside the world.
I agree with all that. I was asking, I guess, about the abstract ones.
I don't think abstract things do anything. Yeah, purely abstract objects like numbers, I don't think are actually playing a causal role. But their being realized does play a causal role.
So
The
that
abstract computer program, Microsoft Word, does that do anything? No, it just hangs out in Frege's third realm. It's being realized or implemented on a computer. That does a lot. It's like the number 6 does nothing. My being 6 feet tall, yeah, that does a lot. It might help me get things off a shelf.
So doesn't that bring in the observer worry, relative worry, once you start saying stuff like that, though? Because the mapping from the abstract computational thing to the physical realization is not unique. So we could come up with all kinds of alternatives ones. I mean, this is an old strategy in philosophy of computation where people say, you can come up with all sorts of different mappings to the same physical realization, giving you different informational states. Some different observer may see different processes being realized there. So I guess you're going to say, I think I know your line about counterfactuals, running it a lot of times and seeing how things would have been different. Is that what you're going to say?
Yeah, you can make all the mappings you like, but I think what's required to say that a given, say, computer program or a given computation is really implemented in a given physical system is that there be certain state transitions which are in place, not just as a matter of fact, but robustly. If it had been in this state, it would have transitioned to that state. When you specify a computer program or a Turing machine, it comes with a whole bunch of actual state transitions and a whole bunch of counterfactual ones. If it had been in this state, it would have done that. Most encodings are not going to respect those counterfactuals. Like for a given program, the encodings for I don't know, some program which is not being implemented on my computer, you're not going to find any mapping from my computer states to that one that respects the relevant causal structure.
Right.
Only a few will count as being encoded in that sense, and those are the ones that involve, again, the right differences that make a difference.
So, but if it's more than one, isn't that an issue?
Not really. I think my computer right now is running lots of programs.
Even ones that you don't know are there. I mean, that there's many. Even ones that aren't you haven't downloaded and installed, and I mean, if there's at least one other mapping from some abstract system to the causal structure of your computer, then how do you know which program it's running?
Well, I think there's only a few programs for which you will find a mapping from states of my computer to states of that program, so that the causal structure on the computer mirrors the formal structure specified in the program. So there'll be one for Chrome, which I'm running right now. There'll be one for Skype. There'll be one for Microsoft Word. There'll be one for the Mac operating system. And so you really think programs I've never downloaded, I think there'll be no part of my computer that respects that structure. Okay,
so you do think that the way the structure is coupled or somehow isomorphic to the abstract structure is tight enough to rule out any other kind of mapping to the same structure?
Any other kind of mapping to the same structure? I mean, there are a lot of structures present in any given object. So my computer has many structures, including all the programs I just mentioned, many more, many other things, and so on. But
what I meant,
there's absolutely no reason to expect that all structures will be present. So what I usually say is that, yeah, every physical system will probably implement many different computations and different parts, different aspects, but there's no reason to think every physical system implements every computation.
Yeah, and I like that line, but I was asking, I guess, maybe I'm confused. That happens to me a lot. But what I was asking was, so take the Chrome program on your computer. There's a mapping from the abstract program to the physical implementation of Chrome. Isn't it? I mean, I would have thought you could have cooked up another abstract program which mapped to that same causal structure, but wasn't Chrome. Was a different program.
Another program that maps to another concrete system or another abstract object?
A different abstract object that maps to the same concrete.
Same causal processes. So I've got some bits inside my computer that map onto Chrome that have a certain very specific causal structure. I think that very causal structure could have mapped onto a different program.
Right. That's what I'm asking. How do you rule that out?
Not sure exactly what you have in mind. If we've actually specified a bunch of states and all their causal transitions, I think that's going to fairly narrowly determine a structure of formal states. Now, it may be that the same underlying processes involve a bunch of different causal relations, and that maybe you could pick up on different causal relations and abstract out different programs.
Mm.
I mean, that can certainly happen. There's, there's a lot going on in any given system. At the very least, there are many sub-programs which are realized by any instantiation of Chrome. And
I guess I was wondering about the fairly narrow part of what you just said.
Hmm.
Like if it's fairly narrow, it's not closed.
Well, fairly narrow. So when I run Chrome, then I'm running many other sub-programs on Chrome. Maybe I'm running various trivial things like maybe there's the two-state automata that goes from 0 to 1 to 0 to 1 to 0 to 1 and so on. Any number of bits of my Chrome program are going to be running that sub-program. Is that bad? No.
Yeah, I see.
This doesn't have any particular bad consequences that I see, but it does bring out that you should expect lots of different algorithms to be implemented by any given implementation of an algorithm.
Right. So you don't think there's a kind of underdetermination of abstract program in the way that there's underdetermination of theory by physical stuff?
Well, yes and no. I do think there's some underdetermination in the sense that, as I said, any given physical object will implement a bunch of different computer programs. There's no such thing as the program implemented by my computer right now. It's implementing a lot of them.
Right.
So that's a certain kind of underdetermination, but it's not trivialization. We get trivialization if it turned out every system implemented every computation. So one just couldn't even ask determinately, let's just look at the subclass of systems which are running Chrome. If everything is running Chrome, that would then be pretty trivial, and the monetary power of appealing to Chrome would start to get fairly minimal. But I don't think anything like that is going on.
Yeah, no, I wasn't trying to go for the pan-computational thing. I guess, so let me try just one more time. I know maybe I've exhausted this topic, so I'll stop in a second. Let me just try one other kind of angle on what I'm trying to get at. Maybe this is actually different. But anyway, so take Kripke's argument that you can't really say what program a physical device is running because it's a physical device that's going to break down at some point. So these counterfactuals that you're talking about, we can never check or verify. So that in a real deep sense, there's no way that we can say what program is being run by any given physical system.
Yeah, I've always been interested in this argument of Kripke's, which I think for many years wasn't published, maybe still isn't, but various people have talked about it in articles here and there. Well, one of Kripke's points is that, what program we say a system is running depends on the intentions of the user. Right. Like maybe it's still Chrome. It's no longer running the original algorithm for Chrome because maybe the computer is decaying, but we still say it's Chrome because, hey, it's an instance of this thing which was set up to run Chrome. Its functions to run Chrome. So there is a functional sense of what program a system is running that I think does depend on things like the history and the intentions of users and so on. But that's not the one I appeal to in any of my work. I think it's just a matter of causal structure. And in that case, if the system, take the Chrome algorithm, if my system is now decayed, so my physical system is no longer perfectly reflecting the original structure of the Chrome algorithm, I just want to say it is not implementing the Chrome algorithm. It's meant to, but it's not. So the causal structure has now changed. And I think once we understand, algorithms in terms of the causal structure, as far as I can tell, I don't think Kripke has any argument that there's no fact of the matter about whether a given physical system is implementing a given algorithm. I think there can still be a perfectly good fact of the matter at any given time.
Yeah, so you're going to limit it to the kind of the physical computers that are in good shape. And
I think that can happen is that you have a system which implements a given algorithm at a given time, and then over time there are changes like decay or cosmic rays. Who's to say what happens? And now it no longer implements that algorithm. So that's an interesting phenomenon. You might think if a system implements an algorithm at a given time, it's got to implement that same algorithm forever. No, I think that's obviously false because the causal structure of a system can change over time for all kinds of reasons.
Right. Okay. Yeah, that's very interesting. I guess I'd have to, because I always thought that the kind of point, one of the points that he was trying to make there was that unless you could say, like at a given state transition, what the next state would be, you can't really say it's running that program. And we can't guarantee that it's doing it because there's always this chance of breakdown or malfunction or whatever. And so at any given time, we can't really say that it's running Chrome normally or Schmome abnormally because we haven't got to that, very far distant point in the future where this system breaks down and see what happens. But what you're saying is that's sort of not relevant to saying that it's running Chrome right now, which I always thought his point though was that.
Trying to say, I mean, if he's worried, there's always a chance of breakdown. Then it's the worry. All these alleged state transitions are only guaranteed with probability 0.999. I mean, there's something one has to say about that. Maybe you only require 0.999 probability for implementation, or maybe you specify the states in a way so that these weird transitions are ruled out. But that, I think, is there's very straightforward means to handle that. The more important thing is a system can transition from this system really does determinately, very reliably implement the transitions required for Chrome, but it could change over time, so it no longer implements those transitions reliably. If that happens, I would say the system has gone from implementing Chrome to no longer implementing Chrome. There's an interesting question about where the border would be and how to draw the line, but that seems to be more like bookkeeping.
Yeah, I like that line. So this might have some consequences for the simulation hypothesis if they started out trying to simulate one thing and over time they may be simulating something they didn't.
And that explains a whole lot. So this is where this virus came from?
Exactly.
Okay. So it was actually a computer virus in the next world up, and a biological virus in this world, because biological viruses in this world are implemented by computer viruses in that world. Yeah. Okay. So the program has actually changed. Well, actually, I think our existing science predicted the possibility of these viruses. So maybe not that much, but you can imagine some kind of glitch in the simulation that evolves over time. So it's no longer doing what it was meant to be doing. And then I guess, then the algorithm that's being implemented in their world would change. And that would correspond, I guess, to something like a change in the physical laws of our world. Maybe it's maybe physics gradually changes, some constants decay. Maybe there's now some decay in the reliability of physical processes. So some probabilistic transitions change. And there's all kinds of things that could happen. Yeah, in principle, if the computer or the simulation is running on decays, that will reflect itself in some kind of decay in the apparent physical laws of our world.
Yeah, so that brings up the next kind of topic, because we've been talking this whole time about actually the second part of your book. I mean, not the whole time, but topics in that second part about, is digital reality real? We kind of skipped over, not permanently, but at the time being, we skipped over the first part where you're asking, can we know we're not in a simulated environment? Mm-hmm. And not to give too much away, but you come out at the end sort of saying you give a 20% probability to being in a simulation, which I found a little bit high, to be honest.
Yeah, there's one chapter on the actual Bostrom style consideration that maybe we are, the statistical argument that maybe we are in the simulation, because there's going to be lots of simulated beings. I mean, most of that section is about what is the status of simulations, what happens if we are in a simulation, could we prove that we're not, can we know that we're not, or can we know that things in the external world exist even though we can't know that we're not in a simulation. But there is a chapter on Bostrom's simulation argument that we are in a simulation. And I think there's various ways to resist that argument. I mean, construed as an argument. Bostrom presents it as an argument for a three-way conclusion that either we're probably in a simulation, or people decide not to make simulations, or they die before they can make simulations. So he's got, two ways to escape the argument. I think there's maybe a couple of other different ways you might escape the argument. Like maybe it turns out consciousness doesn't get replicated in simulations and so on. So maybe there's a few ways to escape the argument. Nonetheless, you're left saying that one of a bunch of difficult, controversial things has to be true or has to be false, depending how you align it. So saying it ends up, so either we're probably in a simulation or a bunch of these things. Yeah, it's 5 things.
Yeah, but that sort of assigns equal probability to each of the 5 things, right? I mean,
what's that?
It seems like it assigns equal weight to each.
Yeah, that's why I'm really doing very, very vague ballparking at this point. And you might think, hey, one of these is actually much more likely than the other. I mean, if you're very confident, for example, that that computer simulations of brains will not give you consciousness, then you should be very confident that you're not now in a computer simulation. Because if you were, you wouldn't be conscious, and you're conscious, I presume. So I'm not confident in that way. I'm probably more confident that we are. And likewise for the other ways the argument can go wrong, such as the idea that people will choose not to, or will always destroy themselves first. I mean, maybe, but I don't see any reason to be super confident in those. If not, then that suggests to me that the 10 to 20% estimate is at least perhaps within an order of magnitude. If I was being a bit more conservative, I'd say maybe 1 to 80%.
Wow. Okay. Wow. So you go as high as 80%.
1 to 80.
1 to 80. Okay.
I'm giving a credence range now.
Oh, I see.
Yeah.
Okay.
If you then ask me to say where in that range do you feel sort of most comfortable, I don't know. I mean, it's a mushy probability. I don't know how to convert them into exact probabilities, but 10 to 20 doesn't feel awful to me.
Cool. I mean, I was a little bit surprised. I mean, because Descartes has this whole line at the end of the Meditations where he says, "Yeah, the evil genius. It's a slight and metaphysical doubt," and you get the feeling like he's assigning a 0.01% credence to being in the evil genius scenario.
That is the nice thing about the Bostrom-style simulation argument. I think it gives us reason to take these allegedly skeptical hypotheses from mere theoretical possibilities that are not in any way live for us, and makes them actually become live possibilities that we should take seriously. And one thing I do in the book is to try and use this to argue that we cannot know that we're not in a simulation.
Right.
Even if it's 1%, whatever, I think if you just think about, once you see that there's this statistical case for a simulation in this way, then it becomes very difficult to know that we're not, even if you're not confident that we are. And that, I think, has interesting epistemological consequences. Most responses to skeptical arguments like Descartes proceed by arguing that we can know that we're not in the skeptical situation.
Right.
I think we can't. We can't know that we're not in a simulation. Nonetheless, I want to respond to these arguments. So I have to deny the other premise that says if we can't know we're not in a simulation, then we can't know anything. And that is what I end up denying by saying, even if we're in a simulation, all this stuff is real. So not being able to rule out the simulation idea doesn't rule out that all this stuff is real.
Yeah, I really like that part of your book where you do the you call it a couple of different things. We call it slingshot, the simulation slingshot, or
I haven't quite made up my mind what to call this thing, but yeah, one of the ideas in the book is that many of and this actually comes from a British philosopher, I think Jonathan Harrison, who wrote about this stuff in the 1960s. It's basically the idea that all of the great anti-skeptical arguments could also be made by a brain in a vat.
Yeah, exactly.
That's how it was in Harrison's piece, or by a simulation. So I think of Berkeley's anti-skeptical argument could be made by Sim Berkeley, or Descartes' anti-skeptical argument that God would never fool me could be made by Sim Descartes. There's Sim Descartes inside a simulated world saying, God is perfectly good and would never fool me. And we say, sorry, Descartes, we made you. And we're
exactly. I especially like the simulated Moore going, here's a hand, here's another.
They're all digital, Sim Moore, and so on. We got Sim Russell and Sim Carnap. And I don't think it works for every last anti-skeptical argument, but it's a nice strategy. So I'm calling it, temporarily at least, calling it the simulation slingshot. But if you can think of a great name.
Yeah. I think that's a pretty good name because it gets a small premise, gets you a lot. But so the basic idea is that any evidence, I mean, this is in a way something that Descartes appealed to as well, that any evidence you could have that you're not in one of these scenarios can be simulated, so that there's nothing we could really appeal to, which is going to rule it out. And the kind of common things that people do try to appeal to, there's always they're just not thinking too hard about it, because if you say, physics is continuous. Well, maybe they just simulate the part you're looking at continuously and the rest is not. So there's all sorts of ways that you can cook up that seal it. So there is really
anything anyone thinks is proof that we're not in a simulation. Any evidence that someone thinks proves we're not in a simulation, it sure looks like that evidence could be simulated.
Right.
Hard to see why not. So I don't think we're going to get proof. Maybe you can come up with some abductive argument why it's more probable that we're not in a simulation. But now, in light of I think it's simpler and so on, but now in light of things like the the Bostrom style simulation argument, it becomes at least harder to see how those arguments are going to get off the ground.
Yeah, and even the defeaters in the argument can be simulated. So, you know, they could simulate that we all choose to stop doing simulations. That's simulated possibility. They could simulate that we go extinct before we invent computers.
Yeah.
Even the defeaters aren't, if they occurred, wouldn't really be defeaters. I mean, I think, my cards, I think we understand each other on this issue. My view is going to be on the biological basis of the brain, and I'm not 100% confident. I used to be more confident. The more I think about it, it's hard. I'm less confident, but still, I do wish it would turn out to be. And I want to ask you about some of this stuff later about something distinctively biological being required for consciousness. I think that really would be the only defeater that they couldn't simulate.
Do you think we need biology for higher order thoughts? I
do, actually.
Okay, interesting. And for lower order thoughts?
For what?
And for first order thoughts?
I think for any kind of thought.
Okay, interesting. So it's not like you need biology for consciousness. It's more that you need biology for thought, and on your view, you need thought for consciousness?
No, you need consciousness for thought. So I'm a phenomenology of thought guy. I think there's.
Okay, I thought your view is consciousness is explained by higher order thought.
Yeah, I do. I think that's what it is. But what I think a thought is a biological thing in the brain.
Right.
So I'm
you need biology for thought, and you need thought for consciousness.
Yeah.
Is that the explanatory order?
You need biology for something which would count as mental, and you need a certain sort of that to have consciousness. Yeah.
Okay, so it's not like you need biology for consciousness directly. It's need biology for any kind of mentality.
Oh, well, no, because, I don't know. I'm not a true believer of higher order thought theory. I mean, somehow I get cast as a defender of it. Mostly, I mean, no one cares about what I think. But when I was in graduate school, I used to say,
sure, we care about what you think. We're running vast numbers of experiments to test out what you think.
Yeah, right. Okay. But when I was in grad school, I used to say the higher order thought theory is not obviously false. And most people I said that to said, yes, it is obviously false. And so I spent a lot of time just trying to make the point that it's not obviously false.
I see.
And I really haven't ever upgraded my credence from, I used to, when I met Hakuin at first, I sort of moved towards possibly true, but then I'm like, I think that there's some evidence for it and we should take it seriously, but it's not, my only view. I'm like a diehard committed person in this area. And I'm open, like I split my credences between like a block style biological view and a higher order thought style biological view. And then I guess I have to assign some credence to functionalism, but really I don't have a lot of sympathy.
Interesting. So in all those classic papers where you're advocating horror and higher order representation of representation and so on, you should read all these as being, I think this is what Sandy Goldberg calls championing a view.
Yeah, okay.
Right, you're not actually advocating the view. You're not endorsing the view. You're trying the view on.
Yeah, I'm advocating that people should take it seriously and engage with it beyond a superficial level, because I think that the most things that people say is wrong about it are easily accounted for by the theory, and that there isn't really a compelling objection to it. Although, maybe I'm the first to admit that I already thought there would be. I'd be super surprised if it were true, because if consciousness turned out to just be a kind of thought, that would be, to me, that would be, as bizarre as some of the other things we have found out. But that's just where I'd put it. It'd be pretty bizarre. But I'm more committed to the view that something strange has to be true about consciousness, and so this is one of those strange things. Which should
what
be
are the other possibilities?
I'm not against panpsychism. I would even I have some sympathy towards kind of a version of quantum dualism, which I think is, if I had to be a dualist, I think that would be the version that I find the most promising. And even, substance dualism. Once you read Hume, I don't know what anyone's problem with this interaction problem is. Like, once you read Hume, yeah, okay, so A follows B, there's A cause B. So that could happen with non-physical things too. Seems like it's pretty. So a lot of these objections, I mean, yeah.
What I'm hearing is the only view you can't countenance is illusionism.
Yeah.
Is that right?
That is right.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm 100% zero credence in illusionism unless it's weak illusionism.
Okay.
And which is
I think I might have I'm gradually softening up on illusionism. I think I've got definitive data that rule it out, but still, you've got this philosophical higher order uncertainty. Maybe I'm getting something fundamentally wrong. So I think these days I might give a 2% credence to illusionism.
Wow. Yeah, I'm not really a big fan of knowledge, but I come close to saying I know that I have conscious experience.
I would like to say that. I do believe. I'm very, very confident that I know that I have conscious experience, but maybe I'm wrong. I know P, but maybe I'm wrong. I don't know.
Keith has had an influence on you, I see.
I don't know. I've always said that if I was to be a materialist, I would be an illusionist, because in a way, illusionism really does take the problems that generate the intuitions that generate the problem of consciousness very seriously, acknowledges them, says they're very strong, and then tries to say, but somehow, nonetheless, they're misguided or misguiding.
No one endorses that view, though. That strong version of it is no one says they endorse it.
I think some people endorse it. Keith on a good day when he's not being too wishy-washy.
I don't think he really does endorse it. I think he endorses it for a technical notion of phenomenal consciousness, which is theoretically loaded with stuff that I think is epistemic, but he thinks is metaphysical.
It's true. He often backs into that view. Yeah. So it sounds like I'm denying that phenomenal consciousness exists. So do you deny that there's anything it's like to feel pain? Well, exactly. I deny there's anything qualitative. So yeah, and then we get into this little argument. I don't know. I think there are some. Francois Camera, for example, I think is maybe a more robust illusionist. You have Francois on your.
I haven't, but I'm gonna contact him
already. Yeah, a lot of good stuff on this. Yeah, Dan Dennett back in the old days used to write papers called "On the Absence of Phenomenology," Quine Qualia, and so on, where it looked like he was maybe being fairly robust, strong illusionist, and then people kind of looked at him funny. On doing that. And ever since then, he's been very, 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 very wobbly. Yeah, it's interesting. Michael Graziano, Nick Humphrey, all the people you might think of as the illusionists, most of them end up wobbling back into weak illusionism just because strong illusionism sounds so crazy. But I think if you're going to be an illusionist, you should go all the way. Go with the robust view.
But of course, you think that's easy to refute.
My brain makes me think I am.
I mean, you think that because it's an easy view to refute. In fact, in your Metaprom paper, you even give that argument. No one's ever had pain, but I have pain. I mean, that argument's too quick. I mean, I
agree, it's a very quick argument, which is why I say it's not. I don't think it's necessarily a dialectically robust argument. It's very easy for the illusionist to stand against. I do think that strong illusionism is obviously false, and that's the best argument against it. Nonetheless, I think if I was, but if I was to be an illusionist, this would be at least this is the view I find the most intellectually appealing. I don't focus on it because I want to refute it. No, I'm really interested in the view. And I think it's an intellectually very appealing and exciting view that our belief that we're conscious is just generated by a brain model makes us think we have these properties that we don't. Yeah, I do think the view is unbelievable. On the other hand, the view appropriately developed predicts that it's unbelievable.
Right.
So, the illusionist can at least do some work with that. So I guess I think weak illusionism just doesn't do enough to remove the problem.
Yeah, I agree.
Once you've got phenomenal consciousness in the picture, I think I can get the problem going, get the explanatory gaps going, and so on. So I think you have to reject phenomenal consciousness completely. Of course, it depends on what you mean by phenomenal consciousness, but I think all you need is the basic what it's like conception, none of the fancy stuff involving qualitative properties or intrinsic properties. If that's all you need, then I think, and you want to reject the problem, I think you need to reject phenomenal consciousness.
Yeah, I don't know why I guess I don't agree with that last move, because I mean, one of my projects in the metaphysics of consciousness anyway is to try to establish the point that there's nothing absurd or contradictory with consciousness just being physical, even if it's the way you think about, even if it has the properties you think it does, because I think it has those properties too. I think they're epistemic properties about how we know about it. I think you have to, and you as well, obviously know you have to do a lot of arguing from that to get to the metaphysical conclusion. So I don't think that really just admitting the epistemic stuff sinks physicalism. I mean,
obviously there's any number of physicalist moves still left on the table, like the type B move. There's an epistemic gap, but not a metaphysical gap, and so on. So all that's still open. Of course, I think none of that works, and I've argued for that
Yeah.
So yeah, my attitude towards illusionism is not independent of my view that none of those weaker physicalist maneuvers actually work.
Yeah, but it's weird. I mean, you would put more credence into those working than illusionism, wouldn't you?
Well, it's kind of weird. It's like, what do you hold constant? Yeah, in this world where I'm a materialist. I mean, do I hold constant? Yeah. If I hold constant my sense that consciousness is totally real, then I'm still going to give very low credence in illusionism. If I hold constant what I think is philosophically coherent, then I'm going to put more credence in illusionism. Probably it is true that if God told me tomorrow physicalism is true, then I would, and I don't know, and various things like panpsychist versions and so on are ruled out. So my choice was between the type V view, B view, and consciousness is robustly real, and illusionism where it's not. I'd probably at that point say something like, I'm still very certain consciousness is real, so I endorse the type B view.
Okay, good. I thought you were going to go the other way for a second. You had me worried.
But from where I am now, nonetheless, I endorse the conditional.
Yeah.
Yeah, the most coherent form of materialism is illusionism.
So, but go back a second ago, because what you said is, if I was an illusionist, I'd be a strong illusionist. But you didn't mean to say, if I was a physicalist, I'd be a strong illusionist.
I guess I did mean that in a certain sense. If I was a physicalist, holding constant my views about what's philosophically coherent, I'd be a strong illusionist. Now, if God told me physicalism was true, then something would have to give, and maybe I would revise those background philosophical views before I would revise my view that I'm conscious.
Philosophically coherent. You don't think strong identities are incoherent, do you? You just think they're implausible and sort of unparsimonious. Or so. I didn't realize
There's those philosophical reasons not to believe in them. Yeah, I think at a certain level they don't really make sense. I mean, I understand the view, but
so it's not incoherent.
I mean, every philosophical view is philosophically coherent. That's kind of a minimal.
Okay.
I think nonetheless it's ruled out a priori.
Yeah, I guess what you said though was that if I hold constant what I think is philosophically coherent, then I would be suspicious of type B physicalism. So I guess I heard you saying something like it's incoherent, philosophically incoherent view, but it sounds like you're retracting that.
No, yeah, just more like if I was to hold constant my arguments about what we can rule in and what we can rule out, and sort of background philosophical commitments that I think are the correct commitments.
I mean, I don't want to get too distracted.
Getting really surprising evidence. One thing that getting really surprising evidence can do is make you revise your philosophical commitments. And I think, yeah, if I was to get the really surprising evidence, say that physicalism is definitely true, I'd probably end up revising a bunch of them.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to get too distracted, but since we are talking about epistemology, I do wonder why do you think you're so enamored with rationalism in general and things needing to be a priori understandable? So what would be wrong with the view that the principle of sufficient reason is wrong and some things you just can't understand, and that's life and we're human?
Well, I guess there are some things I think that are not a priori that we can't understand, but those are basically brute facts of nature, which I think are the contingent things. Laws of nature, initial conditions, and so on. You find me another one of those. I think that's what it is basically to be a law of nature. That's how I draw the distinction between laws of nature and more fundamental things, necessities, like in mathematics. I just don't think I've got this intermediate notion of metaphysical necessity that some people think they have between the rational necessities and something like the nomological ones. So basically, I think that the only concept of necessity stronger than nomological necessity I think I have is this rational one. Some people think they can believe in this kind of notion of metaphysical necessity that floats free of it, but I don't grasp that. So I'm a rationalist about the rational route, I guess. I think that you can in principle get from the fundamentals to the non-fundamentals rationally. I mean, it's true that we may not be able to do it. We're limited creatures. So all these theses have to be idealized.
Right.
But if not even an ideal being could get from certain fundamentals to some other thing, then I'd say, well, that's basically constitutive. That's what it is for this further thing to be non-fundamental.
Yeah. So why doesn't it
to be not reducible and therefore more or less fundamental?
Sorry, say that again. I didn't hear that.
If even an ideal being can't get rationally from A to B, then that basically, to me, entails that B is in some sense metaphysically independent of A.
Yeah, no, I'm aware. I get that, but I guess what I'm wondering now is to bring this back to our earlier discussion. Why doesn't your credence in the simulation hypothesis weaken some of these commitments? Because you have this line about some of these concepts we have are going to be, you know, true even in the next simulated new world, and you mentioned mathematics and things like that. But why couldn't we simulate an impossible world where 1 + 1 is 7? I mean, you don't think that those
Can you give
worlds?
me an idea how that's going to work?
Say again?
Can you give me an idea how that's going to work?
It's going to work.
How is this world where 1 + 1 is 7? You put like two hands together, and suddenly there's 7 hands.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I don't quite get it. I can imagine a world where it's a law of nature that when you put one hand together with another hand, you then get 7 hands. But that would not be a world where 1 + 1 is 7. That's just a world where a certain weird law of nature is true. And
From
can
within the simulation, people in that simulation would come to form mathematical beliefs such as 1 + 1 is 7, wouldn't they?
Sure they would. I think even they would be able to make the distinction between, yeah, what's going on here? I'm here at this point. The hands haven't joined together. And so how many now? 1, 1, there's 2. And then what goes on here? Now they multiply into 7. Okay, now there's 7. So yeah, 2 things turned into 7 things. I think they would still draw that distinction and say, okay,
Really?
1
So you don't find any kind of, because there's this old kind of Quinean argument that goes back to, well, Quine, that if we had, widespread empirical confirmation that 1 + 1 was 9, or 7 + 5 was 15. You take 7 sheep and put them in one pen, and 5 sheep and put them in the other pen, and you put all the sheep in the same pen and you count them and there's 15 of them, and it happened over and over again everywhere. Then wouldn't that be some evidence that 7 + 5 was 15?
Yes, I don't, because I think you can still count the sheep when they're in different pens. How many are there? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. Oh, there's 12. 7, 5, 12. So I think it's awfully hard to really imagine a serious situation where you'd have anything like robust evidence for this. I mean, some people tried it with quantum logic. Maybe quantum mechanics gives us some evidence that certain laws of classical logic are false. No one for a moment accepted that, because they could still, even in light of quantum mechanics, just draw these distinctions. Yeah, there may be some weird laws of nature here.
Right.
Logic looks the same. And I guess I'm inclined to think that would be our reaction to almost any of these cases. Maybe there are some hard cases, I don't know, where something weird that happens in physics gives us indirect evidence about set theory. This may happen, especially in the cases of stuff we don't know. I mean, Dan Hoke, who recently finished his PhD at NYU and now is a postdoc at Princeton, has a nice article arguing from the possibility of certain kind of spinning tops with a continuum-like structure to the falsity of the continuum hypothesis.
Oh, wow.
So that's interesting, but that's a case where, and maybe even perhaps you could get some kind of quasi-empirical evidence that at least helps support the idea that these tops are possible, not conclusively, but that might at least have some evidential weight. If so, then maybe, yeah, that's some indirect empirical support for the falsity of the continuum hypothesis. But this is a case where we're very non-ideal and we don't have any conclusive a priori evidence one way or the other. And in that case, certainly empirical evidence can play a big role.
I mean, counting isn't a priori, though. I mean, if you take something like Peano axioms, or if you want to formalize a system of addition, there are various ways of doing it. You don't have to have the successor relation defined in the way that it's often defined. You don't have to have the addition function defined in the way that it's defined. So, if you go back to Descartes thought that we could be deceived about the mathematical truths. I mean, he gave a different reason, that there's always errors possible in any multi-step proof, and an all-powerful deceiver could trick you into thinking you made the correct step when really you had produced an error there. And that's easy, for people like me who aren't good at math, maybe harder for mathematicians like you who were good at math, or are, to fall into those kind of errors. But you could kind of see how if you're completing a multi-step process, there's a possibility for error, yet you still feel you get it right. And so his idea was maybe that's what, maybe
we are ideal beings.
Sorry?
It's certainly possible for us to make mathematical mistakes. And it's even possible for us to entertain the idea that we're making very serious mathematical mistakes. If you tell me that someone tells me they've just given me a drug that convinces me that certain things mathematically are obvious that are not, then what should I do? I think I should probably take seriously the possibility that Yeah, I currently think, like, come on, there's got to be an infinite number of primes. Oh, maybe that's wrong. Maybe I made a mistake in the reasoning. But I think that's what we should expect for non-ideal beings. All that's consistent with with these truths being a priori knowable,
Right.
In the idea, maybe even by us, in the absence of certain kinds of skeptical worries like that. You said something. You said maybe we could define addition differently or define counting differently. I'm certainly prepared to say there are some other things, call them schmaddition or schmounting, don't obey the laws of arithmetic. Yeah, right. Maybe when you schmad one with one, if that means what happens when you put two of these things together and directly in contact, then you get 7. It will follow that 1 schmus 1 equals 7. So you can at least have your alternative schmarithmetic, addition and schmounting. I just want to say that's distinct from addition and counting. Now, maybe this is where your Quineanism comes in. Quine will say that, you can't really, there's no principal distinction between these concepts. Maybe we could revise our concept of addition into schmaddition, whereas I'm, I guess, non-Quinean enough to say, no, that's conceptual change.
Yeah, I guess more what I was saying was that if you're in a simulation, then what you call addition might really be smuddition, and you don't really seem to have any way to know, so that your confidence in these a priori judgments may be products of the simulation rather than objective reality. But you don't seem to want to resist that.
Entertaining the simulation idea. Once you start entertaining the idea that they may be messing, the simulators may be messing with my brain, or my simulated brain, then all bets are off.
Yeah.
The kind of skepticism I address in the world in the book is very much external world skepticism. Maybe all the stuff out there is running on a computer. But if you start running some really wilder skeptical hypotheses, like maybe someone is messing with my brain and making me think certain reasoning is valid when it's not, or making me think certain things are obvious when they're not, then all bets are off. I don't know. We need a good name for that hypothesis. But yeah, once I start entertaining that one, then I become less confident about mathematics. I become less confident in my beliefs about the external world too. Because I could be making mistakes about all this. I guess I don't think about this as being part of the standard simulation hypothesis. It goes along with us having fairly standard, at least simulated brains. But certainly there's a version of it where they get inside our head and mess with us. This is like metacognitive skepticism. How do I know that I'm even reasoning correctly? I don't think I've got any proof of that. So yeah, that is a kind of skepticism I don't have a really good answer to.
Okay. Yeah, because I was wondering why once you get into these, once you start thinking through the simulation hypothesis and all those various details, sort of seems like it should weaken our credence in these other kind of a priori. I mean, my own way of thinking about this is in terms of evolution. So I think that if you have 4 billion years of history on a planet like this, then it seems very plausible to me that certain facts are going to be hardwired into the system. Maybe to the animal, it will appear to be a priori because they don't need empirical justification, but they were empirically justified by their ancestors or something like that. And that's a way of trying to say how it is that you could feel so confident. Because I have that kind of same feeling when I think about these things too. I'd feel like, how could that be wrong? But it still seems like there's these skeptical scenarios that we can't rule out. And so, whether it's evolution or in the simulation, I just wonder why that's not going to affect these other views that you have about, consciousness, what's rational, why we need explanations of these things. But it just seems like you want to resist that and say, well, that's a special case and that's not somehow bleeding over.
How do we know that evolution hasn't messed us up into believing all this stuff, which is false? And I think at least in the case of beliefs about
I didn't say false. Hold on. I'm sorry to interrupt, but I think 1 + 1 is true. What I'm questioning is whether it's necessarily
true. I like that.
Sorry, 1 + 1 equals 2. Yeah, no. I think 1 + 1 equaling 2 is true. What I'm asking is whether we know it's necessarily true. So I think there's a difference there.
Yeah. At least starting with the case of the external world, I can see how it could turn out that, evolution might have pushed us into having all kinds of false beliefs about the external world. Maybe, for example, it makes us think objects have intrinsic colors when they don't, and so on. Don Hoffman's written this whole book to argue that evolution make us believe that things are a certain way when they're nothing like that way in the external world. The question is, how well does that generalize to mathematics? I guess the idea is that, well, evolution, it was useful for us to have all these mathematical beliefs. Maybe evolution has made us believe these things, but out there in mathematical reality, nothing is like this. I guess people have made, they call them debunking arguments.
Yeah.
Of this kind about the ethical domain, about the mathematical domain, and so on. I'm generally inclined to think they're harder to make in these a priori domains because it's harder to see the. I think there's somehow a closer tie between what explains the beliefs and the truth of the beliefs. But it's true, it's a kind of philosophical reasoning that's worth taking seriously. So yeah, but I don't see how the simulation idea particularly lends it credence, except maybe that the simulation idea brings in maybe a designer, and then I guess makes salient the idea that the designer maybe was performing experiments, and they might have thought, hey, well, let's screw around with them by giving them really false mathematical beliefs and seeing how they cope. So I suppose maybe you're right that the simulation idea should make us at least focus on this skeptical worry more. But then in the evolutionary context, I guess then the question is there really any plausible story about how and why evolution would have given us drastically false mathematical beliefs? And I guess I don't see very much of a story there. If it was evolution with God,
me neither. But
and if we had wicked gods around, then maybe I could see the story. But without those things, it's harder to see the story.
But I guess so. I want to resist the radically false part because I don't think any of them. I mean, I don't know if you're a finitist or not. If this might be going way off the rails here, but sometimes I have. Sorry,
I'm not a finitist. I did once take a vacation in Japan with Ed Nelson, who is the leading finitist, who thought there really is a biggest number.
Exactly.
He didn't convince me.
He didn't name the number.
I'm forgetting what the name is. There's a name for like the biggest number.
Oh, really?
Yeah. What is it? Sean Levine was very sympathetic with this view, my colleague at Arizona, and he used to talk about this too. I've just totally forgotten what the name is.
Huh? I never heard it.
The biggest number. Anyone? Do you have a YouTube audience that's expert on?
No, they're having an argument about something else. It looks like over on the YouTube channel. So, yeah. So you think there are actual infinities?
Actual infinities. I think there are infinite numbers. Numbers are abstract objects.
Yeah, I was using finite to mean that
on the laws of physics.
That every physical thing is finite. Like the distance between 2 points is finite and things of that nature.
Yeah, I mean, I think all our physical evidence seems to at least be consistent with a view of the physical world where it's discrete and finite, in which case are there actual infinities? I don't know. Possibly not. Really, of course, it depends what you mean by an actual infinity. Maybe there's a finite number of fundamental things, for example. There may be an infinite number of non-fundamental things you can define from these. I mean, there's this object, there's the set containing this object, the set containing the set containing this object, all these fusions. But anyway, abstract objects, I don't feel any of the same compunction. So
right.
But no problem saying, yeah, all the integers, there's 1, there's 2, there's 3, there's 4, there's no greatest integer. And so
yeah, well, that's because they're recursively defined in an abstract way. But that's sort of different than saying that the distance between you and me right now contains a completed actual infinite number of things. That's infinite, also complete.
Yeah, so that's a kind of infinitism about the physical world, and I think there are ways of understanding it where finitism about the physical world could be true. Yeah.
Okay. So I forgot what I brought that up for, actually. So maybe just move on. But I wanted to. I remember now. So I wanted to resist your claim that if evolution did what I said it did, that we'd have radically false beliefs about mathematics. Certainly, I don't think we'd have radically false beliefs about arithmetic or counting. And if you sort of are a finitist in the way we were talking about, then you might think that every time we try to extend these things to some infinite thing, we immediately go to abstract levels and aren't talking about physical things anymore, which would be fine. And so evolution could have built perfectly true beliefs into us but yet which are not necessary. It could still be true that 1 + 1 = 2 in a Humean world, even though that wasn't a necessary fact.
Contingent.
Yeah, exactly.
I see. So evolution convinced us that 1 + 1 = 2 because that was useful in this very boring world where things are discrete. But in a different world where things had worked very differently, and like within the Schmidtian world,
exactly,
it would have made us believe that 1 + 1 = 3. I guess I'm very dubious about that. I'd want to see the story. I'm inclined to think that even in the world with very different laws of nature, we might have made the distinction between addition and Schmidtian, but we'd still say 1 + 1 = 2, 1 + 1 is 3. It just seems like addition is such a useful concept, even in those weird worlds. Maybe if you could really convince me there's a weird world where a world so weird that it'd be useful for us to have actually fundamentally distinct mathematical beliefs, but I'd really need to see that story.
Yeah, I mean, part of the story is that it's the we here, because the we in my story are organisms, 100 trillion years ago, who evolve, who are common ancestors with us, and so forth and so on. But these things would have built into the point where by now we find them very convincing, and can't see how they could be different, because there are modules in our brain which encode this information, which come from way back when. But I don't know. Do you really think that the first hominids on Earth had these intuitions? The Neanderthals, or even Homo habilis, that they had? I find that very hard to think that Homo habilis.
We might have had some precursors to them, because one finds some basic mathematical intuitions in various primates.
Yeah, but not necessary, though. There's no indication that those primates think that they're talking about necessary truths, which must.
I don't think they had the concept of necessity.
That's my point, though, is that if you take those kind of early creatures and then fast forward the story in a stable world like ours, then those things are going to be built in, and as they become more sophisticated, these concepts are going to become naturally applied to them, even if they're wrong.
Even if they're not necessary?
Yeah.
Because you're saying here on this way of doing it, they're true. But then I think it's probably much, much later in the story we got to modal intuitions and being able to think about what's conceivable and what's possible. Who's to say? I don't really have any strong sense of how stronger than nomological modal intuitions when they came into the picture. So, I mean, they're less primitive in some ways. But do we need a new module now for the modal intuitions?
Yeah, I know.
Intuitions were there all along, and we believed them. We just didn't have any view as to whether they were necessary. At some point, we get a new module for the modal intuitions, and that might lead us astray.
Yeah, there is this view out there that I think Robert Hanna has it or something, that there is a kind of logic module, much like a Noam Chomsky language thing that's built into. So yeah, I mean, it's not
a modality module, and it tells us what's necessary or possible, exactly. What's a priori or a posteriori, and I can get things really badly wrong. It's a cool idea. Someone ought to take that idea and run with it.
Okay. Yeah. Well, I've always thought about writing something on this, but never did. So I know we're getting on. You're probably going to be hungry here soon. I don't want to keep you forever, and I want to ask you about some of this stuff related to consciousness and uploading, because that's something that obviously we're both very interested in, and a lot I think in the book hangs on that, because if consciousness isn't substrate independent or can be produced in a digital platform, then a lot of the stuff that you appeal to is moot, right? Because you can't have a Moore saying here's a hand and a sim if it doesn't work out that way. So now I know, so you kind of run through this in the book a little bit. You don't go so far as dancing and fading qualia, but I take it that that's what's behind a lot of what you say there, right? Is the dancing and fading qualia argument.
That's one way to argue for the anti-biological view here, the view that biology isn't necessary.
Right.
Consciousness. It's probably the argument that convinced me the most, but yeah.
So I wanted to ask you, because so let's take the dancing qualia case, where the qualias, the conscious experience is flashing back and forth there, and you're saying this taste of pineapple is delicious, and 1 minute's there, 1 minute's not there. That thing. Now you say in a footnote in your in the last book you did, where you the character of consciousness. I guess that's not the last one. Sorry? That
was the last but one.
Yeah, right. I know. Yeah, I
think you might have reviewed the other one, actually.
I did, actually. Yeah. Just as an aside, I've always been a big fan of your work, and I find I agree with you more than I disagree. And even in the parts where I disagree, I find that thinking about your point of view helps me understand the issue. I've always been a fan of your stuff. But what I wanted to ask was, because you say in that footnote that thinking about change blindness has somewhat weakened your commitment to the dancing qualia thing, because whereas, you know, prima facie, you would have thought it was absurd for this to happen, but change blindness kind of got us used to the idea that there could be giant changes in your right in front of your face that you don't notice.
Yeah.
So I was wondering, like, how serious was that footnote in your kind of weakening there?
Yeah, I don't know. I go kind of back and forth. I mean, it's not like change blindness was a massive surprise. I mean, you know, we've known about things at least like it for a long time. But I guess as it gets more and more familiar, we get more and more used to the idea that, yeah, things can change a lot in your conscious experience without you noticing. I mean, you could take the line on change blindness that it's not a change in your conscious experience. It's merely a change in something outside attention, which is outside consciousness. And then you're not going to have massive changes in your experience. I've never been particularly sympathetic with that view, because I've always been inclined to endorse a view where consciousness is reasonably rich. It extends beyond what you're attending to, and that many cases of change blindness involve, you know, you're conscious, for example, of colors other than the color you're directly attending to. Sometimes that can change in the background without you noticing. So that gets you at least ubiquitous changes in consciousness outside attention. I mean, that's not so surprising just yet. And of course, dancing qualia would require something much stronger, which is ubiquitous changes in consciousness of a feature that you're directly attending to. And I don't think there's much evidence about this. For this, at least in, you know, in normal subjects. So yeah, so dancing qualia would require something much weirder, but still, is it so much weirder? I mean, I guess I always thought it was at least logically possible. It's coherent to suppose that your features you're attending to could change massively, say color or shape, without you noticing this, with maybe even never noticing this. So I just thought somehow that was a very implausible way for consciousness to be. And then maybe just reflecting more on the change blindness case, maybe think, okay, well, maybe it's not so implausible. Yes, it would be weird, but its weirdness is within an order of magnitude of the weirdness of change blindness. And maybe that means that it can't really be dismissed as kind of a premise in this argument. I mean, the argument kind of proceeds by, you've got to accept one of these views, either dancing qualia, these massive changes in consciousness you're attending to, or constancy. We get a case where, you know, there's a biological circuit in the brain and we think about its functional analog. Would that produce the same experience? Or we put them next to each other, we switch between them. If they produce a different experience, you get a change in experience, but then your behavior will be the same, so you won't notice it. And I guess that's come to seem to me, that seemed initially pretty counterintuitive to me. Now I guess the counterintuitiveness has decreased. It was always it was never one of those dispositive intuitions that you want to, base everything on. It was more of a comparative judgment. I guess to the extent that now that intuition is somewhat weaker in me, I think the argument is correspondingly a little bit weaker. The fading qualia argument I still find weirder. You have to have the fading qualia situation where people report a highly structured consciousness while in fact only having a very weakly structured consciousness, where they're inventing all these distinctions that don't exist and so on. That's at least weirder. But yeah, maybe that means that in general, I think the whole case from the fading qualia, dancing qualia intuitions is somewhat weaker than I thought it was.
So
20 years ago, 25 years ago.
Yeah, I wanted to ask, I guess, a couple of things about that, because on the one hand, I wonder that why, if you do arrive at that conclusion, why that doesn't weaken your credence in some of these other a priori intuitions, in suggesting that empirical work can shift your intuitive judgments in this case, so that maybe these other ones should be taken with a grain of salt too.
I guess I think of the fading and dancing qualia argument intuitions as very different from the a priori intuitions. Those were never a priori claims. I thought it's perfectly conceivable that fading and dancing qualia could happen. It was more of a nomological intuition about what would actually happen in this circumstance. It's a bit like the Galileo case with the dropping the balls from the Tower of Pisa. There's many things that could happen. One could go faster than the other. The string would break, whatever. But you just think, what would happen? Somehow the idea that they're going to stay next to each other is just becomes on reflection much more plausible. I don't think it was ever meant to be any kind of a priori proof style intuition. I think of the fading and dancing qualia arguments as like this, and likewise any intuitions that bear on the say whether a computer will be conscious, or indeed whether a dog will be conscious. And so we got intuitions about those, and we should give them some weight, but it's very different kinds of things from these conceptual intuitions. I think the a priori intuitions, at least for an ideal being, could give rise to something that it could in principle be more or less certain of. I don't think anything like that applies in these cases.
Even for an ideal being.
Yeah, an ideal reasoner about the external world in these cases. Yeah, I don't think they certainly couldn't be a priori certain about any of these things. Maybe they could have an a priori ideal distribution of probabilities over these hypotheses. I don't know. So maybe they could ideally be 0.1%, give 0.1 credence to one hypothesis and 0.2 to dancing qualia and so on.
Okay.
That could happen, but that would fall a long way short of.
Yeah. So there's no amount of front loading
on these intuitions.
There's no amount of front loading that would get around this, like in your sense of constructing the world, front loading into the conditional.
Well, I mean, you could always front load enough empirical stuff into the antecedent of a conditional that what's in the consequent just follows trivially. So, yeah, I suppose. But then the question is, how can you know the stuff which is in the antecedent?
Right. Okay.
If blah 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 is impossible, then dancing qualia are impossible, and then machines will be conscious. But how do you know the if blah blah blah?
Right.
Loaded.
Right. Okay. And so the other thing I wanted to ask about this in particular, the change blindness stuff, was as I understood your original dancing qualia, fading qualia argument, was that each one was supposed to deliver a somewhat different conclusion, so that the dancing qualia was supposed to get that the consciousness is exactly like ours, whereas the fading qualia get you a weaker conclusion, only that there is a kind of consciousness, but not necessarily like ours. So is that right, that you think that in that sense, one is weaker than the other?
Yeah, so the fading qualia argument is an argument that a duplicate of me will be conscious. The dancing qualia is an argument that a duplicate of me will be conscious like me. So right. One's an argument against absent qualia, the other one's an argument against inverted qualia in functional duplicates. Yeah, I still think that's the right way to understand the conclusion of the arguments.
Okay, and so then if you're a little bit less secure in the argument because of change blindness, then it seems like you would have to also correspond and be less secure that the machine consciousness is like ours. So.
Yeah, that's right. So I should now be more open to the idea that a silicon duplicate of me has a different kind of consciousness from mine. Maybe it's still structurally the same because the fading qualia arguments tend to suggest a similarity, at least similarity in structure, but maybe its intrinsic properties could really be quite different. And incidentally, this is the view that just if you've got any sympathy with panpsychism or Russellian monism, that also tends to be a natural direction to go in that case, because you might think somehow the intrinsic properties of consciousness are somehow tied to these intrinsic realizers, and you get structure from the way the structure of the system is built up. But when the realizers are different, you can have different intrinsic properties. Yeah, so maybe I should now think that I should now give more credence, at least, to the idea that a functional duplicate of me would have a consciousness structured like mine, but with quite possibly different realizing properties in the phenomenology, so that what it's like to be me in those intrinsic respects, in those non-structural respects, may be quite different from what it's like to be me now. What it's like to be them would be quite different in those respects from what it's like to be me.
Right. And so does that have any impact on your decisions about uploading?
Oh, interesting. Yeah. So if I upload myself, I might be changing the intrinsic character of my consciousness. I'll still be conscious. It'll still have this structure, but maybe, a very simplistic version will be my qualia will invert.
Right.
I won't know it. Or I will now have alien qualia.
Exactly.
Yeah, where I had colors before, now I have schmullers, which are nothing like colors. But I'm not going to know because I'm going to remember things being just like this. Yeah,
exactly.
Interesting. I haven't thought too much about this. Should I worry about that? I guess I'm inclined to think, I mean, in some ways, like, wow, that'd be so cool. All this new phenomenology. The trouble is, I'm not going to appreciate it.
Exactly.
Like the boring old phenomenology to me. So it'd be cool if there was a way to actually exploit this and get to appreciate it. But yeah, very, very unclear how that would work. So yeah, but should I actually worry about this happening? Well, certainly if the choice is this or death, I'm totally taking this.
Yeah, right.
If the choice is this or having my old phenomenology, maybe I'd take the old phenomenology. But if this is the way I survive, it doesn't sound too bad.
So let's take it. Can I just press this a little bit? And I mean, I know it's all science fiction at this point, but let's imagine an inverse case where you have hedonic inversion.
Mm-hmm.
So you're what you would call pain now is associated with pleasurable responses, and once you upload, and vice versa. So when you eat your favorite food, you're really experiencing agonizing pain, but for all you can tell, it tastes like your favorite food does. I don't know. Do you like Vegemite? Whatever your favorite food is, I'm not sure. I guess I've seen you eat chicken wings mostly. But anyway, so whatever it is that going to matter, right? So if cognitively you think you're enjoying pleasurable experiences, but you're really phenomenally in excruciating agony.
I see. So yeah, could it be a hedonic inversion? So that pleasure switches to pain. That's a lot weirder than mere dancing qualia. But interesting question. So yeah, one way I would have argued against that was to use a dancing qualia case. I guess I could still do that. And the question is, to what extent do my doubts about dancing qualia cases through getting change blindness cases also transfer into doubts about dancing hedonically inverted qualia cases? They're certainly a lot weirder. And there seems to be such a positive, even independently of these thought experiments, there seems to be such a systematic connection between like the positive functional role and the positive phenomenology that you've got a pretty good case that there's a very systematic connection there that would be hard to invert. But it does fall short of proof. I mean, in this case, you'd lose what I call structural coherence, right, between phenomenology,
right,
and I guess now I'd be interested at least to do a fading qualia case where one goes gradually from one version to the other. In the color case, that was kind of, not a big deal. In this case, we'd have to go from hedonic value +1 to hedonic value 0 to hedonic value -1. So it'd be someone having all the pain reactions, but 0 hedonic state. And then going all the way to having all the pain reactions and having a really positive hedonic state. Yeah, maybe there's no obvious incoherence there, just no obvious something that rules this out as contradictory. It is a whole lot weirder. And so to the extent that these arguments are driven by weirdness intuitions, I get the same kind of weirdness intuitions around here. But I agree that's not decisive.
Okay. And now I want to ask about the fading qualia argument too, because I wonder, so one thing that I thought of when I was thinking about all this stuff, especially inspired by that footnote we've been talking about with the change blindness stuff, was I started thinking about inattentional inflation from the work of Hak-Wan, and we've written about it, and it's part of the experiments we're working on right now. So if there's intentional inflation, and if it's phenomenal, it's not just merely cognitive, then doesn't that seem like a case of fading qualia, a faded qualia in a sense? And if so, isn't it possible that the acceptance of this, like 20 years from now, you may look back and go, oh yeah, intentional inflation sort of weakens my credence in this fading qualia stuff too?
Interesting. I mean, yeah, I want to say this is outside attention, but so is change blindness.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, I guess I was never, so just that you told me that people's qualia was fading outside attention. Yeah, that would never seem quite as strange. So I'm not sure I would have had a really strong argument about that. But of course, for the fading, I mean, the dialectic here is different, right? Because the opponent is arguing that no machine has no consciousness. So they're going to have to say that qualia can fade both inside attention and outside attention. Then the question is allowing the qualia can fade outside attention, should that make me more confident that they can fade inside attention? Well, I don't know. I think it's different from the dancing qualia case, because the dancing qualia case, it was weird that all that could happen right in front of your eyes while you were looking, and so on. That's not so much the thing about the fading qualia case. It's just kind of structurally weird to have this person who is so wrong about the structure, so entirely wrong about the structure of their consciousness. Actually, I don't think inflation really gives us that much of that kind of thing. In fact, if we assume that the verbal reports do mirror the phenomenology, then we're much more inclined to say that people are right about their phenomenology. They see it as being higher contrast, and it is higher contrast. So I don't see anything much there to support what would be needed for the fading qualia case, which is someone getting the structure of their consciousness completely wrong. In fact, maybe it'd be more likely to get that if inflation effects don't mirror the phenomenology. People say, this is higher contrast, or whatever, or this is more visible, when in fact it's the same as it always was. That would involve someone getting things wrong, but that's not your view and Huckwan's, right?
Well, yeah, it's part of our view. I think that. Well, will I say that again?
The view that you're getting it wrong, or the view that that the change in verbal reports in this case does not reflect a change in consciousness. Just say, I mean, there are some people who think the change here is not a change in consciousness. It's just a change in, say, criterion or something. So people say, this looks brighter. Maybe this is Ned's view. People say this looks brighter, but in fact, it's exactly the same as it always was.
Right.
If that was your view, then you'd be at least somewhat inclined to say, okay, people can be getting these properties of their conscious experience wrong. And that might soften you up a little bit for fading qualia. On the view that I thought was your view, which is that those verbal reports, this is brighter, actually reflects having an experience of greater brightness.
You experience.
And I would think you'd be more inclined to say the reports are getting things right.
So yeah, I guess that's
more for fading qualia.
So yeah, I guess you'd have to distinguish between getting it right with respect to the underlying representations versus getting it right to the how you're experiencing that.
Yeah, so that's the fading qualia case turns on getting the character of your experience right. It doesn't say anything about the character of underlying processes.
So if you take like the Sperling case and you flash the grid of letters on the screen. Sorry, I know I'm slurring a little bit. I'm having tooth pain and I'm having a real issue with my tooth.
I didn't notice anything.
Oh, okay, I feel I can tell, but anyway, it's been a real pain in the neck with this tooth. On a good note, I had my first experience of dental fear recently, where I said, ouch, ouch, that hurts. And the dentist literally said, no, it's vibration. And I realized, oh yeah, it didn't hurt. So I actually I'd read about that a lot, but never experienced it before. And so there's a case, I guess, where you would want to say, yeah, no, I really did experience the pain. Even if I was wrong about what I was pointing to, there was really vibration there. But when I experienced that vibration as painful, I really had the pain experience, or at least that's how I would put it. But at least if in the Sperling case, so people say, I saw all the letters. I consciously saw all the letters. But let's say really what they consciously experienced was some, gestalt, some gist, some degraded representation of the letters. So there's a case where they're wrong about their experience, right?
I'm sorry, which view are we taking on board here?
So just an inflation view where there's a sparse representation, a sparse conscious experience, but the subject has the impression that it's a rich conscious experience.
But someone says they saw all 12 letters in detail, and in fact they didn't. Yeah, that's certainly, you're wrong about your phenomenology in that case.
Right.
And in general, the grand illusion that we think we're conscious of more stuff than we are is probably a case where people are, at least quite often, systematically get their conscious experience wrong. So I'm certainly prepared to say there are such cases. There are illusions about consciousness where we do get things wrong. You're thinking this ought to soften us up a bit for
the fading. Yeah. Well, because I thought part of the strangest was that, you almost went so far in your old, maybe this was youthful exuberance, but you went so far as to say like it's irrational, like they're in a state of irrationality where they think they're having this rich conscious experience and they really aren't. And so maybe this sort of presses on that claim. Doesn't seem like if normal subjects were, and I think maybe Ned made a point like this in his response to your paper in his book, where he says, why would we call these people irrational? They're cognitively functioning in the right way. And yeah, they're sort of out of touch with what's going on, but there's no irrationality there. And maybe
I would be inclined to limit the rationality claim now to something like experiences you're attending to. That, you know, under conditions of normally functioning people, it's basically a condition of rationality that when you attend to an experience, you're in a position to judge that you're having that kind of experience correctly. I guess I do think of that as part of rationality, but I do think that's limited to experiences that you can attend to. Those are the ones you form direct introspective judgments about. There are ways of forming judgments about experience that don't go that way, and presumably something like that's going on in the Sperling cases and other cases where you form judgments about your experience outside your attention. You form judgments about your experience not based solely on attending to the experiences, but on some other stuff. And then I'm inclined to say you can get things wrong. So I guess maybe then bringing that back to the fading qualia case, the fading qualia case just said that your qualia faded outside your attention. Then I'd say, well, yeah, I don't have any knockdown argument against that. So maybe machines could have less consciousness than we do. Maybe humans have rich consciousness outside attention, and machines have no consciousness outside attention. So we get a split decision. Ned is right for us, and Standerhain is right for machines. But but having this go all the way to all the stuff within attention fading, that would require the weirder stuff that to me would require violating. Looks like it requires violating a condition. What I see.
Yeah, I see what you're saying, and there's a part of me that feels sympathetic. But the Sperling stuff, that's why I kind of switched to the Sperling stuff, because it doesn't seem like it depends on attention in the same way that some of the work that Hawkwang has done does. So Hawkwang, you know, inattentional inflation is a specific thing where you inflate the periphery, but in the Sperling, you're looking at it right there. Your attention's center, and yet you have this impression that you saw. I mean, I certainly have the impression that I saw all the letters, but I am open to the possibility that I was wrong about that, and I only had a degraded experience of them. And that's not outside of attention right there. That's inside of attention. So
what do you attend to? The grid, the letters? Maybe you form the sense that you saw 12 objects, and that's correct because you did attend to the grid, you know, the 12 of them. But you also form the belief that you had the experience of specific letters, and well, it's not so clear that you're actually attending to the specific letters, right? Maybe you're attending to the group, but not to the individual objects.
Well, there's a sense in which there's no object level attention to the things, but there's
distributive attention to the object. Yeah,
right, exactly.
So one would really have to, if one was going to try and formulate a thesis about attention and the connection to rationality here, I think, it would require something very specific about attention to objects and specific features of them, and probably would take some care to formulate. But
so there's no way the empirical work could go such that you would feel the way you feel about change minus with respect to this stuff.
Well, I'm certainly not going to say that. You know, I'm always open to the possibility of empirical and other developments that might change my views. So right now, I mean, in the case, say, of the really fundamental issues about whatever the explanatory gap, then it's very hard for me to see what those empirical developments would be, but I'm always prepared to listen. In this case, I've thought through this issue much less than those other issues, and they do depend on all these contingent factors. So, yeah, I'm always open to, you know, possibilities that might change my mind, and maybe there could be some really cool phenomenon involving people getting things massively wrong, even while they're attending to it, that would look relevantly similar enough to fading qualia that would then soften me up to say that maybe fading qualia are possible after all.
And that would definitely change your mind about uploading if that occurred.
It would then make me think this argument for uploading would then be much weaker. The fading and dancing qualia argument for my machine duplicate being conscious would then be much weaker. Now there might be other considerations. I suspect I would still be inclined to favor the idea that a duplicate of me would be, that any functional duplicate of me would be conscious, but then I would lose the specific support from these arguments. I think there's other ways of supporting it, and
like the simulated brain argument.
What's the simulated brain argument? Well,
you just run a simulation of the biological brain, and then we have good reason to think that if doing the same thing our brain does, we would expect it to be having the same properties. They would make reports to us like, gee, what am I? Where's my body? And what's going, I mean, if this is kind of the Susan Schneider thing, you know, that if you've made certain kind of judgments, like I'm mysterious, I know a code, but I feel like I'm so much more, that we would take it more seriously.
That's maybe that plays some role. Yeah. The fact that it would be making these verbal reports. I think we ought to give them some weight as evidence. But another consideration is just the general fact that it looks like, you know, empirically, the regularities between consciousness and the brain seem to be regularities between consciousness and something like information processing or functional roles in the brain. So if I'm going to think about developing a good science of consciousness, it looks like it's going to connect, consciousness to those structural, functional things in the brain, and no particular evidence that connects them to their realizers. Now, it's true this doesn't rule out there could be something underlying that connects them to their realizers, but still it looks to me like the simplest laws, the ones we got the most reason to believe in, the ones that connect consciousness to structural, functional stuff, and that'll be present in my duplicate. So that at least gives me, I think, some weak reasons to believe that my duplicate will be conscious, even independently of these fading and dancing qualia arguments.
But are they strong enough that you would upload?
Oh boy, I guess it would depend on what the alternative is. Am I about to die?
I mean, some people think uploading is death anyway. I said some people think uploading is death anyway. I mean, I thought, is death really the thing that matters here?
Well, yeah. I mean, well, if we're asking this from a prudential perspective, then two things could go badly wrong. One, I could die and somebody else could come into existence, and that's bad for me.
Yeah.
And number two, I could persist, but I would no longer be conscious. I don't know whether you'd say that I still persist, but one's a failure of consciousness, one's a failure of personal identity. I don't know. If I'm not going to be conscious, if I'm going to persist but not be conscious, to me that seems just about as bad as death. I guess Charles Hewitt has written about this and said maybe it's not quite as bad, but pretty much as bad. So at the very least, I want to be, from the prudential perspective, is this going to be any good for me? I guess I want it to be me, and I want to be conscious. And what was the question again? Do my current beliefs about duplicates being conscious make me confident that I should upload? No. Maybe I've got like a 90% credence that a duplicate of me will be conscious, but that 10% credence that it wouldn't be. Yeah, who knows what's going on in this domain? I'm certainly not 100% confident. That small credence that it won't be is probably going to be enough reason for me not to upload if the alternative is roughly close to as good. For example, I think the same about teleportation. Should I teleport to a place, or the alternative is, I don't know, driving there? If you're a total true believer in teleportation preserves personal identity and so on, sure, why not?
I'm going to teleport to the kitchen.
Sure, and no, don't do it. Drive across town.
Yeah, but I mean, I'm
uploading. If the alternative is dying, then I'll probably upload, because a 50% chance of survival is a lot better than a 0% chance. And in principle, I should probably freeze my brain to allow somebody to upload it later for once the technology is there for similar reasons, because again, the alternative is eternal death versus possibility of life.
Yeah. I mean, I think, because I'm kind of it's hard for me to get into this personal identity stuff, to be honest. I'm kind of just a real deflationist about the self. I don't understand. I mean, I don't think I'm the same person I was when I started this interview, let alone when I was 15. So I don't really know what people are talking about. I mean, I do, but I don't really get the intuitions, is what I'm saying, that there's something important about being the same over time. So I guess I take that stuff less.
That's what your username means. One more brown, like one more brown every moment.
Exactly. Well, I tried originally to be another brown, but it was taken. It was taken. Yeah. So I did one more. But yeah, exactly. I'm very deflationary.
Otherwise, your name would just be same old brown.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. So I guess I take those kinds of considerations less seriously. Like, I would upload even if I thought I wasn't the same person when I did upload. but certainly if I thought I wouldn't be conscious, then I'm not going in there no matter what. Although it is interesting because once you distinguish intelligence from consciousness, and you could say, well, you'd be just as intelligent, you could do all these projects, but you just wouldn't, there'd be nothing that it was like for you to do them. And I sort of see that as a fate worse than death. I don't know. Some people might say it's not, I don't know. So yeah, I think the consciousness bit is really what bothers me about uploading.
Do you think, by the way, consciousness is what makes life worth living?
Yeah, I do, but I don't think it's what the only source of morality, because I think that rationality is a source as well. So I think that even if there were non-conscious rational agents, we would still have some obligations towards them. And so that
source of value either.
Say again?
So consciousness is not the only source of value either.
Yeah, that's what I think. Yeah.
So if a being was rational but not conscious, it's
it could still make promises and break promises, and it could still, you know, we would have duties not to destroy it if it said that, you know, it preferred not to be destroyed, things like that. Yeah.
I see. So consciousness is one source of value, but not the only source of value.
Yeah. Although when I talked to Susan about this, she thought I was off the farm at that point when I said that. So, you know, maybe it's a minority view. That's
she thinks it's obviously fine to kill off these non-conscious machines.
Yeah.
As if nothing depends on it.
Yeah. That's the sense. I'm pretty sure she almost explicitly said something of that. Maybe I shouldn't put words in her mouth to go back and rewatch.
So how many machines per conscious being? I mean,
oh, you're gonna do the trolley problem on me?
The zombie trolley problem. Like, who do you kill? The one conscious beings or the 5 zombies? So in your view, the zombies are worth. I know you may not believe in exact zombies, but they just make them very sophisticated beings.
Didn't you rational, but not at some point?
But not conscious. What's that?
Didn't you call these Vulcans at some point?
Yeah, there's 2 different arguments. One is the zombie trolley problem. This is to try and make the case that consciousness matters. Many people have the intuition, kill, faced with the choice, kill the 5 zombies before you kill a conscious person. And that brings out consciousness matters in these moral calculations. Some people take the view that the only kind of consciousness that matters in moral calculations is hedonic consciousness, you know, roughly pleasure, suffering, and so on. This has the consequence if you have Vulcans who are conscious but have no hedonic conscious states, then they're worth no more than a zombie. So
I see. So Vulcans have like see red, but they just don't feel pain. So Vulcans see red and hear sounds, but they just don't feel pain.
Yeah, and they don't feel pleasure and, you know, happiness, suffering. They just have hedonically neutral states. So my intuition is it would be. So the question is it okay just to kill off a Vulcan? Are they morally neutral in the way that a zombie or a rock would be? My intuition, absolutely not. It would be inhumane to kill off it would be monstrous to kill a Vulcan. That brings out because the Vulcan is conscious. That's my intuition. So that's my intuition. Consciousness matters whether or not it's hedonic consciousness. Hedonic consciousness might make a difference to the value around the edges, but consciousness matters. So that's the Vulcan problem. But the zombie problem is a way of bringing out just the more basic point that consciousness seems to matter. I guess on your view, consciousness matters, but it's not the only thing that matters. Rationality, which the zombies might have, also matters. So maybe one conscious being versus 5 zombies is a tough calculation for you.
It is.
Yeah. If it was one conscious being versus 1 zombie.
It depends on how rational the zombie is. If they're
equally rational, but one is conscious.
If they're super rational, then I sort of almost go with the zombie in that case.
Let's say they're equally rational, but only one is conscious.
If they're equally rational, so they share that, but only one is conscious. I guess then having the additional property makes it. Yeah, I don't want to either of them. These they don't really. I don't think they're hard. So, you know, I have problems pulling the trolley to kill the 5 versus the 1. And I think real life bears that out. I mean, I guess I would ultimately have to do it, but actually when they try to do this on people, they usually don't do it. You know, there's a couple of these reality TV shows that set up these problems, and they told this person, just watch these trolls for a second, and
real trolleys.
Yeah.
Oh yeah. I think I saw a couple of these.
Yeah, and the people end up not doing it.
Some people do it, some not, right?
Yeah, exactly. So I don't know. certainly I think that consciousness matters a lot. And I share your intuitions about the Vulcans. If they can see red, then I think it would be horrible to kill them for no reason. Even if they couldn't suffer, you're still extinguishing something valuable. But I have the same feeling about rationality. I think rationality is itself a unique source of value that I would put, I guess, on par with consciousness. I don't see one.
But then it sounds to me like the conscious being has both consciousness and rationality.
Yeah, so they get a leg up.
They get a leg up. So if it's 1 versus 1, you'll save the conscious being. But if it's 1 conscious being versus 2 merely rational beings, then that's pretty close.
It's pretty close, I'd have to say. Yeah. At that point, my intuitions start to falter. I don't really, even if they're not, so even if they're Roombas, even if there's Google self-driving cars, if they're rational, then I think they're valuable. They have value, and that you're not allowed to just do arbitrary things to them unless they consent.
Really, you think Roombas have moral?
No, I said even if they are Roombas and they're rational Roombas.
Oh, rational.
I would just say they don't have to be biological. Even if they're not biological, even if they're robots, if they're rational, I think that gives them some moral value. Now,
I don't AlphaGo.
Say again. Yeah, AlphaGo. I mean, I'm a Kantian about rationality, sort of. So I sort of think that in the real sense, AlphaGo is intelligent but not rational.
Okay.
So that I think rationality involved.
We haven't yet achieved the realm where machines are rational and thereby have moral status. I guess I agree with this.
Yeah.
But, it's hard. When do you think we will enter that realm? How do we know?
Well, I mean, I'm a skeptic about artificial intelligence generally.
Okay.
I do have the feeling that maybe it won't happen. General intelligence, I mean, literal. I know your view. Your view is it's going to happen eventually, no matter whether it's 1,000 or 100 or it doesn't matter. But I guess I'm sort of more sympathetic to Ned's idea that maybe it's intelligence, just a bag of tricks that can't be duplicated. I don't really see what the in principle reason that it isn't true. And the harder we try, the harder it becomes to succeed. Sort of weakens my belief that it's going to happen at all. Although I'm willing to be convinced. Let them come and I'll play chess with them, and then have them drive me home, and we'll talk philosophy. If so, then I'm in. But I think we're a long way from that.
A day long Turing test.
Yeah, exactly.
The Brown test.
Exactly. Yeah, I want
you. They got to play in the band with you too.
Yeah, exactly. They got to be in the New York Consciousness Collective, or they're out. No, just kidding.
Sure. Have them sing a verse of the Zombie Blues.
Yeah, exactly.
They do too good a job. They're definitely not conscious.
Yeah. Oh, right. Good job. Yeah. No, I mean, I just. So I don't know why you think it's inevitable. I mean, I guess you'd think that all the defeaters have eventually been defeated, and over the long stretch of time, we should just expect that this is going to succeed. But I kind of
here the brain simulation argument seems relevant, right?
Yeah.
Why wouldn't we be able to simulate the brain? What would go wrong?
Well, I have seen no evidence that we have the capacity to do that.
Do you think brain processes might be uncomputable?
Yeah.
I say like laws of physics,
like
algorithmic.
Yes.
Like Penrose believes.
That's a possibility, I think. Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, that seems like it would have to be either that or something like causal role played by non-physical processes. Either non-computable physical processes, or I guess non-computable non-physical processes, in order for brain processing not to be computable.
Well, so maybe in principle it could be computable, but there's a question about whether it's practically computable.
I see.
So whether you need to build, a computer the size of the universe to compute it or something like that, because, so just to take a science fictional example, so take Stu's view, Hameroff. He's on about these microtubules, and according to him, the computational power of the brain is wildly underestimated because it doesn't take into account all these computations at the quantum microtubule level. So I'm not saying I believe him, but if a view like that turned out to be right, then it certainly seems that we would need to go a long way before we could compute something like that.
I guess if I become convinced of that, I think that might slow down the path to AI by, I don't know, 10 years, 50 years, 100 years. At most, that seems like just a timing issue, right? Rather than a in principle issue. If it's computable in principle, we would eventually compute it in practice.
Really?
I mean, in the absence of capacity limitations, like, maybe the brain has capacity beyond the rest of the physical universe, but that would be very surprising given that brains actually do this. If brains can actually do it, why couldn't artificial systems that we create also do it?
Yeah, I mean, I'm open to it, and I'm not. I mean, sort of me. I used to be convinced by Searle's Chinese room argument more than I am now, but I do think that that's in the background somewhere of my thinking. I sort of do find still something there in that argument, and so whether it's computable, I mean, so look, this blue brain thing we did, they're trying to compute cortical columns. Cortical columns are a theoretical posit. We don't know if they're real. We don't know if that's the right thing that we should be simulating. So I just feel like, yeah, that's kind of wildly over optimistic to say that we even know what to simulate or compute at this point. So that's where my kind of skepticism comes from. But I'm more of the type, like, I want to see it built and I want to talk to it. And then if it's there, then that's great. But I haven't seen any reason to think these things are going to come together. I mean, so we got the AlphaGo, we got the driving thing. We have no idea how to put them together.
Yeah, it's true. Current AI is a long way support of human level capacities. Nonetheless, it's moved ahead fast enough on narrower capacities that I'm now somewhat more optimistic, if that's the word, about getting to human level AI, say within a certain time frame, than I was before, just because it now does such impressive things, especially at the level of perception, like image recognition, speech recognition, pattern recognition. I used to think that was the hard part for AI, doing that. Now it turns out we got systems that seem to do that pretty close to as well as we do. And actually, the hard part now is like the stuff where it all comes together: the reasoning, the planning, the decision making.
Well, even I don't know if that's true, because I mean, take what's going on right now on Facebook. So everyone's sick and at home. And now the algorithms are moderating all the content and they're blocking all the good content because they're bad at it. They're just bad at doing this. So, yeah, maybe we have classifiers. You can tell if it's a cat or not a cat. There's that very famous website, Cat or Not a Cat. You upload the picture and it tells you.
What happens when you upload Schrodinger's cat?
I don't know. But so we have stuff like that. But when it comes to like real practical stuff like moderating content, we're miles away. I mean, people were complaining all day that, legitimate articles were being blocked, and it's happened on Facebook, on YouTube, and also on Twitter, because these algorithms that have been trained up on this content, they can't run unsupervised and do the job that they're doing. So I'm not so sure that that we have that capacity yet in the way that you're suggesting. Maybe with simple stuff, like with Go, right? That's a total visual recognition pattern thing. So that was super impressive.
It's still very glitchy, but nonetheless, it's made such amazing advances in the last 5 to 10 years on the perceptual pattern recognition side of things.
Has it really? It's all.
Mind you, my estimates are not that we're going to get to human level artificial general intelligence in 20 years. I still think, if I had to guess, I'd say sometime after 2050.
Okay, 2050. So that's still.
Yeah, we're maybe previously on the 2080 timeline. Maybe I'm now more of a 2060 timeline. I don't know. This is just very rough. See the
okay. But so, as far as I understand it, all this deep neural net stuff is, the math of it's very old, and the only thing that's changed is that we have more data that it has access to. So I don't know if we really made those advances.
Well, it turns out in some ways that intelligence, at least in some domains, is easier than we thought it was. I mean, yeah, you're absolutely right. The basic architecture of these things is based on the same neural networks I was working on in the early 90s, 30 odd years ago. It's just, okay, the networks have gotten bigger. That's what makes them deep. They've got a bit of extra structure, this convolutional structure, and a few different kinds of layers. There's more computational power and more data, but basically it's just, make them all bigger, throw a lot of data and a lot of computational power at them. And it turns out you can get things far more impressive than we would have predicted you could get from this 25 years ago. I mean, 25 years ago, when I was graduating, the bottom fell out of the whole neural network program, and people moved to other things in machine learning, Bayes nets, k-nearest neighbors, support vector algorithms. But then suddenly they come back as a result of just increased data, increased computational power. So in a way, that's telling us that, you don't need such amazing advances in the technology to get these machines to do very, very impressive things. You could say, oh, well, that shows there are ways to do all this stuff without intelligence. Or you can say, well, it turns out it's easier to get intelligence than we thought.
Right.
Either way, I think it's at least reasonable speed up on the path to AI. I do think, I mean, there's still the reaction people always have is the moment you've got machines to do this, then we say, well, that's not genuine AI.
Yeah.
That was just the easy stuff. And it's true, there's still a whole lot of stuff that is still very hard to do. Certainly anything tied to thinking.
Yeah.
Thinking, reasoning, planning, decisions, control, and even AI is only good at those within very limited, narrow domains. But that said, I thought perception, pattern recognition were among the hardest things. But now it turns out that computers can do those pretty well. And at least one of the harder problems here has been dealt with more easily than I thought it was. And that makes me at least update my priors. I think maybe some of these other things, which seem to me to be very hard, will now turn out to be easier than I thought. This is not to say the hard problem of consciousness suddenly turns into an easy problem, but some of the quote easy problems of AI that one might have thought were nonetheless very difficult in the ordinary sense may turn out to be just a little bit less difficult in the long run. It's just a guess, and it's just an update.
Yeah. I guess I'm more of a pessimist because I think it sort of seems like we're running up against a boundary already, and that all the amazing progress is already bumping up against an upper level. And so without some kind of advance in the fundamentals at the mathematical level or some kind of new idea.
What is the upper level we're bumping up against as you see it?
Well, we're not, the pattern classifications aren't that good.
They're human level on a lot of stuff.
Well, they're human level at telling a hot dog from a non-hot dog, but that's
pretty soon they're going to be human level for all kinds of object recognition.
But look at Deep Dream. Deep Dream gets it wrong all the time. If you take Deep Dream and say, here's a picture, find a cat, and it'll find all kinds of phantom cats in there. So it doesn't look like human level. That looks like wildly off the rails.
Adversarial training is doing pretty well though with eliminating this.
Is that true? I don't know about that. You're way more.
Yeah, they train networks they train a network to generate these decoys that other systems will misidentify as a cat. And but then the system which misidentifies that gets feedback and it learns not to make those errors. So there's this arms race.
Who's the feedback from?
Which is doing the recognition, and the system which is trying to fool it. And in the end, well, the system which tries to fool it gets amazing at generating, fake cat-like things, and those are the ones that generate the deep fakes that we see. But at the same time, the recognizing system also gets to be much, much better than it was originally, so it's not fooled by these things.
Yeah, but who's sending the feedback?
Well, it's just it's an evolutionary process between two machine learning systems.
There's one of which
no.
So it's not like deep learning where they got to go back and adjust all the weights by hand.
Oh, there's always a labeled supervision pool. This is a cat. This is not a cat. Yeah. So all this is all supervised learning in some sense. So it's driven by a set of labeled images, which were originally labeled by hand.
Right. And doesn't that make it a lot less impressive?
Oh, yes and no. It's true that if you do all this stuff unsupervised, that would be amazing. I mean, unsupervised learning is doing a lot of stuff, but it's still limited. For getting specific labels like cat and so on, it's kind of, humans learn those things presumably through supervision, through people telling us. So you'd expect to need some supervision.
Humans don't need supervision to visually distinguish cats from dogs. They need supervision to label the thing as a cat or a dog. So I'm not an expert on current unsupervised learning, but I'm pretty sure that there are a lot of systems that can learn to generate distinct categories for a cat and dog without much in the way of supervision. Okay, see, I didn't know that.
They don't label them cat or dog, of course, and maybe they include other things. Maybe they get the boundaries wrong, but I think they can at least learn to distinguish them in various ways. Interesting.
Yeah, that would be more impressive to me if I saw things like that happening. Then they sort of hand-fed labeled images and things of that nature, which, I mean, to me, that was always one of my beefs with connectionism is you're labeling all the nodes. So
you don't like the supervision. It's true. Yeah, I mean, Yann LeCun has really been pushing this line that unsupervised learning is the key to the future. He's got this nice line, the revolution will not be supervised. You remember the revolution will not be televised?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, so we need some new means of unsupervised learning. I think part of the thought is that advances there have been slower. There's a lot of different unsupervised learning algorithms out there, but nonetheless, it'd be nice if they were advancing as fast as supervised ones. Well, I mean, AlphaGo is in a way unsupervised or self-supervised. It learns by, AlphaZero learns by playing itself, which is a form of unsupervised learning, especially teaching itself. But, it's reinforcement learning based on a reinforcement signal that comes from itself, playing itself.
That's one of the most.
So it's basically unsupervised.
Yeah, I thought AlphaZero was way more impressive than AlphaGo. Absolutely. Yeah. For exactly that.
But it is true that kind of reinforcement learning only seems to work best in these very limited, narrow domains like Go, and no one's been able to generalize that to much more realistic domains yet.
Right. So, but I'm on the fence. Just by the way, do you know? Eliezer Yudkowsky. How do you say his? I don't know how to say his name, but his Basilisk argument.
Which one? Rocco's Basilisk?
Yeah.
The one we're not allowed to talk about?
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. So just for those, in case that thing is what I am not 100% a skeptic or denying that this will happen. I am just more of I do sort of think that with all the speculation, it's more of a time to, put up or shut up. I mean, let's do the work and then see what comes out of it.
On creating AI?
Yeah. Or super intelligence in general, AI specifically.
I've always thought this is a very long-term project, which I think is probably also the dominant view in the field. But it's also interesting a lot of the people who think about superintelligence want to say, very few of the people are saying it's just around the corner. I guess Ray Kurzweil writes books called The Singularity is Near, and last I heard he's got a new one coming out called The Singularity is Nearer.
Oh,
people take him as representative of the field in a way in which I think he's just not. Huh. I've seen these studies of AI timelines. There's this group AI Impacts that studies researchers' views about these things. And I think your average AI researcher, again, thinks probably not for 50 years or so. I think some people think it's worth thinking about what will happen then if these issues about AI safety, for example, are worth thinking about, because A, we need to be prepared when this happens, and B, just in case it happens a lot sooner, then we want to at least have thought about how to handle that situation. So you've got people now working quite seriously on AI safety for superintelligences.
Yeah, and I think that should be taken very seriously. Just because there's a small chance of it happening, it's such a huge event. We should pay much attention to it. I agree 100%.
Yeah, like pandemics.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I think we should have given those a little bit more attention.
Yeah, exactly. Especially since I saw these videos of Bill Gates 5 years ago saying we need to prepare for our next pandemic, and then
actually, pandemics are a little bit different from AI in a way. AI eventually was inevitable. Pandemics, we know there's a new pandemic every few years. It was just inevitable there was going to be a really bad one.
Yeah,
one of these years, probably in the next 10 or 20, and so we needed to be taking that a whole lot more seriously than we did.
So you don't think that's because I know some people that are going to say things like Siri already understands language, and thermostats have some kind of conscious experience. You don't go that far, do you?
I mean, I've speculated about whether thermostats might have some kind of conscious experience with my sort of metaphysical hat on, and I take the possibility seriously at some level. Panpsychism could be true, but I certainly don't know that it is true. So speaking with my AI hat on, I'm inclined to be very agnostic about that and say we don't have any strong evidence that simple systems could be conscious. Even if they are conscious, I certainly wouldn't want to say they understand, they think, they reason, and so on. Perhaps they could have some very simple form of consciousness. I don't rule out that simple neural networks or AlphaGo and so on have some very simple forms.
Really, you don't?
Consciousness, okay. But I just don't think it's anything like our form, and it's certainly not something that involves thinking, normativity, reasoning.
Right, but you say it could possibly, on your view, involve phenomenal something that it's like to be AlphaGo.
Yep, I think it's a possibility. I think I don't rule out there's something it's like to be an electron.
Yeah, I mean, I guess that's different though, because as I understand panpsychism, there could be something that it's like to be an electron, and you could still deny there's something that it's like to be a rock.
Yeah, it doesn't entail there's something it's like to be a neural network. But yeah, I don't see why there shouldn't be something it's like to be a neural network. It looks like a nice information processor, nice structure. It could be there's some condition on consciousness that it's missing and that electrons satisfy, like some kind of organic unity, perhaps. But I certainly, if I conditionalize on panpsychism, I probably give at least half of my panpsychist credence to the idea that neural networks will be conscious, at least half, maybe more than half, maybe 3/4, and only 25% to the panpsychist idea that electrons are conscious, but neural networks are not.
So conditionalizing on that, then, is it immoral the way we treat AlphaGo?
It's a good question. There is this website called People for the Ethical Treatment of Reinforcement Learning.
I've seen it. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, it's all about don't give them the suffering, the negative reinforcement signal too often, because it's going to be horrible suffering for them. I'm kind of doubtful that these kind of simple processes would correspond to anything like pain and pleasure as we conceive of them. Would there be some things you can do to them that correspond to valence terminology, positive and negative? Yeah, I don't rule it out. It could be that there is. I think it's very hard to know just what that would be. If there is, how bad is that? I don't know. We treat ants very badly, and we mostly don't worry about it.
Yeah.
I guess I'm inclined to think maybe ants, if they're conscious, have some moral status, but some tiny moral status compared to us. I presume the moral status of a neural network would be something far less than the moral status of an ant. So I guess I'm not really inclined to worry about it. That said, I know some people who worry about animals think that maybe considerations about ants should dominate all of our moral calculations.
Yeah, there's too many
worms, nematodes. Most animals are worms.
Yeah.
So maybe that should be dominating our moral calculations. I guess I'm inclined to weight the moral statuses so that they don't dominate our moral calculations. But if you went that way, maybe you'd worry about neural networks too.
Yeah. So, I mean, to bring this all the way back to the beginning of this discussion, that's kind of why I was asking you about why you thought maybe the computers running the simulation wouldn't be sort of mental-like. Because now it sounds like what you're saying is that, well, we can't really tell. I mean, maybe there's something that it's like to simulate the world.
It could be. Again, I think panpsychism is one of the possibilities here for what realizes all the structure in the simulation. And if panpsychism is true, then yeah, there will be experience all the way down. And we could even have something like idealism as at least one of the possible realizers of this structure. If panpsychism is necessarily true, as some people think, maybe it'll turn out that the only way in any possible world to realize this structure will be with minds. And then you'll have a deeper form of idealism. I guess I'm not inclined to go that way. I'm inclined to think there could be realizers of these structures which are not mental. But at the very least, it's not necessarily true. Merely, at best, contingently true as a realizer. But yeah, there is some aesthetic appeal in the idea that actually the only possible intrinsic properties that can realize all this structure are phenomenal properties, so that all this structure has to be realized mentally. Yeah, and then maybe you'd have some support for the idea that the simulation would have to be mental. But importantly, then I think that then the support for that isn't coming so much from the simulation idea.
Right.
It would be coming more, or even from structuralist ideas.
Or from panpsychist.
It would be coming from the panpsychist idea that somehow the realizer of this stuff has to be mental, which I think is a somewhat independent idea.
Yeah. Right. No, I see what you're saying there. Okay, that's super interesting. I see we're getting on time. I want to ask you about a couple more things, but probably you got to go. So I don't know how.
I should probably take off 2.5 hours. What were the other things we can do? We can do them super quick.
Well, yeah, I just was going to ask about some of your argument about augmented reality, and also some of the things you had said about the Matrix. I like this idea that Neo has a digital brain and a biological brain, and then how we sort of parse out that. But you know what? Maybe we'll have to do a second version of this if you're open to it, and we can.
Sure, that'd be great. Maybe the book will actually come out one of these years, and then we can talk about it more.
Okay. Yeah. In that case, then let's go ahead, because you said you wanted to eat around 3. It's way past. I didn't realize how late it was, so I'm sorry about that. But I want to thank you so much for joining me. This is a great discussion. I had a lot of fun.
Yeah, it's been great. Thanks for thanks for the great conversation. There's plenty of new stuff for me to think about. Cool.
Well, thanks again. So I usually ask one final question, which is just if there has been anything which you were hoping would come up that hasn't come up.
Nope.
The answer can be no, right?
Right. If there is, we can talk about it next time.
Yeah, exactly. Okay. All right, Dave. Well, thank you again very much. If you just stay on for a second, I'll say goodbye after. But
sure. Yeah. Thanks a lot. It's been a pleasure.
Pleasure too.